All right. Good morning, everyone. For the for the people down the end of the table, sorry that the table is so long that you're right at the end. But I do hope that you'll be able to discuss and we can see each other. The idea was that we could have a sort of an intimate sort of discussion, hence the long table. So my name is Cherry Short, and I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Social Work, which is now the Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. As you all know, our name was recently changed. It's my great privilege to be able to stand here this morning and to introduce the Race Symposium on behalf of Marilyn, of our Dean Flynn, who, because of all the rain and as we can see, it's been one of those mornings, it's taken people who are traveling quite a lot of time to actually get here because of it. And Californians aren't really accustomed to rain. I come from Wales, so I'm so used to rain. I can never understand how people are so fearful of the rain, a little rain, and they go into a terrible sort of depression. So, so I'm glad that we are here anyway, and we have actually made the effort. And our guests from outside, we're truly grateful to you all to come in and wake up so early and come here this morning to participate in this event. But the person that I would really like to introduce to you is Dean John Jackson, and he's sitting here on my right. And I know many of you around the table know him, but I just wanted to say something personally about him, and I hope he won't mind. But when I went to see him to talk about having this race symposium, he was just so open and caring and thoughtful, and he was everything that one could imagine a person that thought about the issue and wanted to do something that was different in society to make our lives better. And what came over to me was, because I was feeling pretty low because of the whole election bit, and after I left him, I felt so joyous. It was a strange thing that came over me. I mean, it was like, Saul on his way to Damascus, and I saw the light. It was one of those epitome moments in my life. And I felt so good. And it's indeed my pleasure. And he's stuck by this. We've worked it out. He's been, so supportive and caring. I couldn't have wished for a better collaborator in this. And, all his work that he's done, I mean, I'm sure you can read the extensive things that he's done. He's perfectly fit to lead our discussion this morning. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dean Jackson.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you. I feel like Road to Damascus references are hard to live up to. But I do remember that meeting we had, because it was this moment where we were still trying to come to terms with what was happening. And, we talked about a lot of the ways in which the election is just such a poignant context for the discussion we're going to have, and for the ways we might have to reimagine the ways in which we approach discussions of race in the academy. So thank you for even inviting me to be a collaborator on this. I commend you all for trying to organize a discussion, and it's going to be hopefully a discussion where it's not just a conference you can check in on or out of at will, but will be engaged, and that's why we've structured a little bit differently, so we can talk a little bit about that. The one thing, so I'll be very brief. I will say part of what drives me is this sense that in a lot of ways in the academy, but also in sort of the general society, in some ways I would argue that we're a victim of our success around discussions of race and racism to a certain extent. And most of it's because we have this sense, I would call it hubris even, that it's one of these categories we think we already know. We think we know it very well, and we have this sense of mastery over it. And what I'd like us to do today, in a way, is to pull from what a colleague in the humanities, Houston Baker, calls the need to commit to a deformation of mastery. To think about all the ways in which we can humble ourselves enough to unlearn what we think we take for granted about these categories, and then to hear from other people ways to reconfigure our approach to it. I think that's really important. It's also important, I think, at this moment, when clearly, even to bring up a discussion about race, is already to enter into this hyper-politicized environment, right, where the only racists left, to hear some people tell it, are the folks who want to talk about race at all, right, the folks in this room. Right, to invoke it in any way, shape, or form in the quote-unquote post-racial world is to bring back what we've already dealt with, to hear some tell it. And some who might actually have a lot of power to make decisions about how universities like this one operate vis-a-vis questions of inclusion, diversity, and all that stuff. I think that's important to remember. So the stakes are high for us. It's also, I think, an important moment because there are all these ways in which what I find most powerful about this discussion and what we can potentially pull off from it is to have it at a school of social work means we can do something that's often difficult to do in the academy. So at Penn, we have this mandatory course for all of our social work students. It's a mandatory sequence in racism. And so they have to engage this topic. They start their careers with us and they end their careers with us, thinking substantively about race and racism. And one of the things that always happens in that course, no matter who teaches it, is you re-rehearse this sort of binarism between the folks who can think deeply about the issue, conceptualize and quote-unquote theorize it, and often hide behind the opacity of theory, and the students who are clamoring every day for some way to drag that stuff into the practicalities of their everyday world, their clinical world, their field placements, their policy concerns. Like, how do you do that? And there's a way in which I feel like social work is so perfectly poised to force the academy to actually think about how we reinforce and fetishize that distinction and how unhelpful it is to continue to perpetuate it. And so what we wanted to do today really was to put social work in conversation across disciplinary formations with other folks who are thinking about race and racism, but not always coming out of the traditions that social workers take for granted. So we have historians in the room, we have anthropologists in the room, folks from nursing, childhood studies, because those folks should be taking advantage of what social work has to teach them, especially as it continues to negotiate that distinction between theory and practice. Right, between the conceptualization, like sometimes deep, thoughtful, critical race theorizing around this stuff, and what it looks like and feels like in a palpable, embodied, and materialized way in the world. And so that's what I want us to try to do today. And so part of what we thought we'd do in our lines, already told her she's going to try to resist it, is to get people, so you've set your papers ahead of time. It's great, hopefully people ahead of time, if not to read it all thoroughly, at least to get a sense of the gist, to see how you work, how you're thinking, conceptualizing stuff. And what we wanted to do is really have people just talk to us, to us about how they approach the issue, how they translate it into their research activities, and then to use that as a way not to feel like we're having kind of choppy, truncated kinds of presentations, but an ongoing conversation that we're building upon. And so hopefully it'll feel that way. It won't be too stuffy and formal. But our job is to make sure we don't leave here, every one of us, unless we have something we can take from this discussion that we didn't think we had before. To me, that would be a victory. So, and it might not be the same thing for all of us, and that's great too. So I'm glad you're here. Should we go around quickly and just say hello?
Yes.
Maybe we'll start with Devin, and just go around, and then Arlene, you can take the first. Arlene.
Good morning, everyone. Devin Fergus. I'm at Ohio State University. I'm in the Department of African American and African Studies, as well as an appointment with the Glenn College of Public Affairs. And my work deals primarily with issues of the racial wealth gap, and sort of trying to work out that praxis that John sort of talked about.
Good morning. I'm Flannery Stevens. I'm a professor in the business school at the University of Utah. The work that I do, and we'll obviously get into it later, looks very much at race and segregation within organizations, and I draw a lot on political science and legal studies and a whole other host of topics. So yeah, we'll talk about that later.
I'm Kat. I think you all know me. I work in Sherry's office.
And the one who's helped to organize this
Yes.
very diligently.
I'm Dan Hester. I'm also in the Office of Global and Community Initiatives. I've been just assisting more on the periphery of this conference, but I'm really responsible for our global and national immersion programs that we do worldwide. So good to have you all here.
I'm David Wilson. I'm at the University of Delaware in political science and psychology. My current appointment is as Associate Dean of the Social and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Delaware. My research is in public opinion and survey research methods and experimental design. I specifically focus on the measurement of racial attitudes and how that affects people's behaviors and perceptions of events.
Hi there, I'm Larry Palenkas. I'm chair of the Department of Children, Youth, and Families here at the Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Public Health. I have to use the entire name. I get slapped on the hand.
Better than the electric shocks, right?
Yeah, better than the electric shocks. My work for a number of years has been in the area of health disparities. I've done a lot of work with immigrant and refugee populations, both here in the U.S. and elsewhere.
I'll stand because I'm at this end. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michal Morbrock, and I'm chairing the Department of Community Organization and Business Innovation at the school. And Larry said the full name, so it's on record. And my research is on global diversity management, and I have a joint appointment in business school, so I really cut across the two areas. And there's a lot that we can learn from them, and they can teach us, and we can teach them. And so I'm really looking forward to this symposium, and I thank very much all of the guests and the organizers.
Good morning. My name is Raphael, and I'm here at this school. I am involved in field education. I'm also a filmmaker, and I look at how race is represented in film, especially in documentaries. And I teach a course in which students really explore the concept of race within their documentaries.
I'm Terrence Fitzgerald, clinical associate professor here at the Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. Previously, before coming to the academy, spending over 16 years in public and higher education, working on the ground and also with grassroots organizations. But primarily my research looks at underserved population of black males and looking at how systemic racism affects them within public education and higher education, and what are the barriers that are set in place overtly and covertly to stop their advancements.
And Terrence is one of the persons who actually helped us to come to this table, so thank you, Terrence.
I'm Tian Parker-Dominguez. I am at the school as well. I am Vice Chair of Curriculum for the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, and Clinical Associate Professor. I live in Austin, Texas, so I'm one of our virtual faculty members. I'm actually physically here.
Are you really?
I teach exclusively in our online program now, and so I am able to live in Austin, Texas, closer to extended family. So I'm one of those who traveled in. And my area of research interest is in racial disparities and adverse birth outcomes, infant mortality, preterm delivery, low birth weight, and having been trained by a health psychologist, I really take sort of use a stress paradigm to understand how racism can operate and sort of get under the skin to affect physiological processes that could result in an adverse physical health outcome. So I am particularly interested in Dr. Geronimus's work because she's one of my heroes from the weathering hypothesis. So I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you.
I'm Lauren Silver, and I'm an associate professor at Rutgers in Camden, New Jersey. And I'm from a department of childhood studies, which is somewhat unique in that it is completely an interdisciplinary department. When we center children and youth, how does that change the way we think about history, social policy, media? And my work, I'm a feminist ethnographer, and my work is with youth. It spans child welfare and urban education. And the work I'm going to be talking about is specifically with young mothers of color in the child welfare system and their families.
I'm Jody Armour. I'm over at the law school, Gould. I've been writing about the intersection between stereotypes, prejudice, and the rule of law for a long time. I particularly think about mass incarceration, police brutality, racial profiling, the core issues of Black Lives Matter, and really what I've been addressing in my scholarship. And now I'm looking at a lot of ways that linguistic and non-linguistic forms of symbolic communication can be used as political tools. Colin Kaepernick's afro, for example, kneeling for the flag during the ceremonies, how those kinds of political statements that make a lot of people uncomfortable resonate with our discussions about campus freedom of expression and uncomfortable conversations we have here through people's linguistic and non-linguistic forms of symbolic communication around one another.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Martell Teasley, professor and chair of the Department of Social Work at the University of Texas at San Antonio. I'm really a school-based social worker in terms of research, and my substantive area has shifted quite a bit, but it initially was and still is African-American adolescent development. And I'm really concerned about how Black children are socialized in schools. And so that becomes a large prism, and that is quintessential to many of the challenges that African-American children face.
Good morning. I'm Eric Guerrero. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Social Work, and also have a joint appointment at the Marshall School of Business. I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. This is certainly a very exciting conversation that connects with my work in the sense of kind of how organizations respond to diversity, how they think about it, how do they reproduce it in services. Particularly I'm trained in organizational science and implementation science to be able to respond to healthcare disparities and other issues that vulnerable populations face.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me. This sounds pretty exciting, actually, now that I've heard how you're conceptualizing it. I mean, it sounded exciting before that, too. But I'm just saying. Okay, I'm ready for a nap. I am a professor at the School of Public Health and the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. And I've been there for 30 years, and I've been working on issues related to promoting health equity and understanding and eliminating population health inequity for about, close to 40 years, I hate to say, which has given me a sort of front row seat in seeing how good public health is and in the context of our broader society at, either holding tight to old wine in old bottles or possibly figuring out how to put the old wine in new bottles. And so even though as a profession we were charged around the late 1980s, so 30 years ago, with eliminating population health disparities, particularly racial ones, they've grown in that time. And I've been sort of trying to be a constant gardener in pushing for different ways of thinking about race in the context of health. And most people think of it as some essentialist characteristic, and sometimes they're thinking genetics, and sometimes they're thinking culture or behavior, or some strange legacy of slavery or poverty, or and so I introduced the concept of weathering, which I'll talk a little about when it's my turn to talk, and now I'm very eager to interact with people who are more practice-based, because it's clear nobody's doing what they should be doing for whatever reason, and I think a lot of the reason is that people just can't get beyond some sense that how race and health are connected has to in some way be through some essential characteristic.
That's great, Arnold. Thank you. And I do feel like the other nice thing we highlight when we go around the room is how wildly eclectic this room is. So the presupposition should be that you're not going to understand what everyone's saying, or at least not approach things the same way, have the same methodological assumptions. That's good, so we can ask questions we wouldn't ask maybe in other contexts. So hopefully we'll feel free to do that.
Okay, Dean Jackson, there you are.
Oh, excellent.
Just call on me and I'll make sure everybody's in order.
Keep people in line. Well, glad you're back. There's still a couple of stragglers, but we'll get it together. And really, all I want to do now is pass things off to Dr. Arlene Geronimus to get started. Now, hopefully you've gotten a chance to at least look at the work, so she knows she's not going to be able to cover it all. But
I like that social control.
but the floor is yours. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I'll do my best to be socially controlled, even though most people say I'm impervious to social control. But as I said, I'm in public health and interested in population health, well, inequity now, but hopefully someday equity. Or moving us closer to that. And as I said in my introduction, there's usually these differences in health are conceptualized as due to some sort of essential difference. What that essential difference has changed over time, or different reasons. Well, I don't know if they're unreasonable. People disagree on what it is, but to give you sort of the bottom line for me, I think that the relationship between race and health is really a contextually fluctuating conceptual construct, and that the actual health impacts of social identity, whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, or any other, you can fill in the blanks, are contingent and work through structurally rooted biopsychosocial processes. And when I say they're contingent, I mean they're both contingent on aspects of life that have been structured, that's why I say structurally rooted, in terms of our history with race. And there are also differences in everyday life, and so that even for the same person in the course of a day, their health may be impacted positively or negatively depending on various life experiences they have as they go through that day, or various environmental threats that they are subjected to within that day. And so there's not just some characteristic, like you could say in a regression equation, you call race and you see how much about race, is associated with your health outcome, and then you sort of more or less project what you think race means, which can be anything from, genetic inferiority to racism, but none of which was ever measured. But that, in fact, as I said, it's much more dynamic. It's all about what our experiences are with other people, within our lives, within the structural location we are in, at work, at home, in the broader society. And so I should go faster, I guess. So I don't know I hope you had a chance to read the paper. I'm going to give you a tiny bit more background and then just cut to the chase about this paper. So again, I think that the way to think about race and health is the question should really be, how does socially structured race become biology as opposed to being essentially biological? How does this social construction have biological consequences? And I said that the more common things people believe are some kind of race gene, some kind of behavioral risk factors, or culture, or poverty. Obviously, we care a lot about access to health care, and I'm not going to say that's not important, not because it's a primary prevention target. I think it's important because since we get it so wrong, what causes the differing health trajectories for people from different groups, at least if everyone had access to health care, we could treat the diseases that result, even if we don't prevent them. But what's part of the impetus for this paper is I was concerned you know, I sort of had my Obama to Trump moment in the field maybe 10, 15 years ago before either Obama or Trump, in the sense of that it looked like there was a movement towards social determinants of health and towards caring, there just being widespread agreement that there was no just racial genes, and it was all gene and environment, and so that was all very exciting. And then, this is an example of the old wine and new bottles, as public health got much more molecularized, they came up with ideas that in effect were the same as if you had a racial gene. They called it, you know, fetal programming, for example. They call it epigenetics. But what it basically means is that they limit what environment means to things like the uterine environment, the cell environment, just very physiological and narrow environments. Maybe the environment in your first year of life, possibly up till your third, but then again in adolescence, but nothing beyond adolescence. So it's a very narrow version of what environment could mean in the gene environment. And then by adding this word programming, they are able to say, so then you are programmed epigenetically by having a bad uterine environment, for example. And then suddenly when you're 50, you'll get hypertension because of what happened to you in utero. So, and leaving out everything about life experience in between. So my entire work, weathering in particular, has been about how life experiences over time accumulate and impact health, and how, in fact, that the years of most concern are probably the young adult through middle ages, the exact ages that everybody else says are problem-free. So that's weathering. I wanted to also point out that the metaphor of weathering I chose was chosen with the thought, being attuned to it as a contronym, that it can mean opposites. And it can mean to withstand or come safely through, or it can mean to be worn away. I've found it very interesting that while I've always had weathering as encompassing both meanings, people get much more attracted to the worn away part than the, which I think is interesting in itself. I think population weathering is a function of exposure to structurally rooted biosocial stressors over time, and that's the wearing away part, but also the strength of autonomous protections to mitigate, resist, or undo them, which is the other part, and then the empathy, support, resources, power, or validation in the broader society. And I think all of them are important and obviously interact, but one of the things I've also written about, not talking so much about it today, is the ways in which what we try to do, public policies, often disrupt the autonomous protections. So things that people think they're doing to help are actually probably increasing weathering. So, so the simple notion of weathering is that chronic stressors inherent in living in a race-conscious and unequal society may cause blacks, or again, other marginalized groups, to experience the morbidity and mortality of whites or other dominant groups who are significantly older. And just to show you a couple slides from old weathering work, this is excess mortality in the blue line. The blue line, does this have a pointer or anything? Anyway, the blue line is the white national average, the red line is the black national average, the green line represents Chicago's South Side. And what I want you to see in this graph is, first of all, what I call a weathering pattern, which is that there's disparities all along the line, but they get bigger with age. They're not just the same size across the life course. And that I purposely started this slide at age 25 because everybody thinks the excess deaths to African American compared to Euro-Americans happen between 15 and 25, and they're all about homicide or drug abuse or crime. But in fact, the disparities exist, but are very small in those ages. And where the disparities really increase is, you know, again, going from about 35, 40 up to about, you know, 60, 65. And when we deconstructed this by cause, it was the main causes of death at all ages were chronic diseases. And certainly at the highest risk ages were chronic disease. And so we've completely misconstrued, we as a society, what these disparities are about. And similarly, this is hypertension prevalence, one of the chronic diseases that's very studied and matter of concern. And again, I just want to point out to you the weathering pattern again, but I also want to point out to you that black women starting at about age 35 or 40 have as high rates of hypertension as black men, and then they go higher than the black men. And that's something, again, we tend to conceptualize it as a black men's disease. And certainly the rates are unexcusable for black men as well when compared to white men or women. But it's actually black women who bear a broader burden once you get into about age 35 or 40. And that's important too, is my reproductive slide, because we all, you know, there's much greater rates of low birth weight, infant mortality, preterm birth in the black population than the white. And again, people focus, I think, on the wrong things. They're focusing a lot on teenage motherhood, or, but if you look here, again, this is the probability of infant death by maternal age. And what you mainly, I mean, you can see whatever you want to see, but what strikes me as important about the slide is that at any age, the black rates are so much higher than on the left is the white and on the right is the Mexican, but also that in fact the younger aged mothers have the healthiest outcomes among the black women. And that only the whites have what people think is the universal relationship of kind of a U shape where the teens in the older ages are much higher than sort of the 20s and early 30s, which are supposed to be the developmentally best times to have kids. But, and the Mexicans start going off the charts when they're around 30. So there's just, every population has its own relationship between age and infant outcome, which is not because there's something inherent or programmed about each population, but it has to do, I argue, with the degree to which they weather and when they weather as a result of their structural locations. And I'll just pass that. I did want to show this one because it does relate to policy, I think, which is, this was what happened to Latina mothers in Iowa after the Postville raid, which was this horrific raid you may have heard about, immigration raid. And right where the lines for both the foreign-born and U.S.-born Latina mothers start to go up is where the Postville raid was. And so what we found was that in the entire state, not just among the people who were in the Postville raid, not just among foreign-born or undocumented Latinas, but for all Latinas, the probability of low birth weight was affected by the stressors and stigma and, I would say, contingency of social identity of being Latina after the Postville raid. And so while weathering is mostly about accumulated stressors, it also means if something is so stigmatizing or so threatening, both in real, I mean, some of these people were literally threatened, others weren't. Others had family members or friends who were threatened or wonder when would they be threatened, even if they weren't threatened yet. That kind of social identity contingency can have huge effects very quickly. So the paper you read, I probably don't need to go through because you've read it, haha. And I wanted to kind of hoist, I guess, I mean, the uncharitable way about me to say it is I wanted to hoist the molecular people on their petards, but another way to just say it is that telomeres, which are the caps of chromosomes, or those parts at the end, and they kind of keep the chromosome stable. They're kind of dedicated proteins, but they also shorten each time the cell divides with each mitotic division until the cell becomes senescent or dies. And why does that matter? I saw it as not just some random molecular thing, but as a possible measure of weathering, because telomere length shortens for all of us as we age, but it shortens for some people faster than others. And as it does, it can lead to this greater increased vulnerability in all your body systems. So it's not sort of disease of the month club, but it's how your entire system erodes. There's some evidence that stress impacts telomere length. The premise of the paper was that the effects of these multiple stressors induce weathering among Detroit residents, expressed as accelerated aging gauged by telomere length, and we predicted that the pattern of weathering across, we looked at whites, blacks, and Mexicans living in Detroit, and that the pattern of weathering across those groups would reflect the harsh conditions for all the residents of Detroit, so they would all be not doing as well as, say, national averages, and they weren't. But that there also variation among groups in identity safety, both threatening contingencies of social identity and autonomous protection. So I want to bring back that other side of weathering would mean there'd be variation among the groups. And in particularly, I'm concerned about, in the social determinants literature, people are very quick to think everything's material, that it's all about whether you're poor or not, or at the bottom end of that income distribution, and not that material things don't matter. I don't want to get misunderstood, but I actually think that in Detroit, and I think it's also very important to do more local community-based studies rather than to just think blacks or whites or anybody else are the same across the nation. You can just control, say, for their income or poverty level, and then you've made them all the same. That poverty in Detroit is a marker of material resources, but it's also a marker for how the history of racial segregation structures current risk pooling, opportunities for cultural affirmation, and exposures to othering encounters. And so the current risk pooling and opportunities for cultural affirmation come under autonomous protections, and exposures to othering encounters involve having greater or fewer numbers of encounters in your daily life that other you, which I think weathers you. And we found that when we looked at them, if you're trying to tell me I'm to be done, huh? Okay. And just looked controlling for age and gender, we have basically the same telomere lengths. You want to have longer telomere length is the good thing to have. And so we could have sort of declared victory and gone home and said when you put whites, blacks, and Latinas in the very same place like Detroit, they're all going to do equally badly. But in fact, that wasn't completely true, because if we then broke them up by poverty status, we found that the white non-poor did what most people expect. They had longer telomere lengths, so they were doing better than the white poor, but that the black poor and non-poor were equivalent, and that the Latina, they were Mexican. The Mexican poor were doing better than so that they were an interaction with poverty, which I attribute to I won't go through all these slides, but I'll just go quickly and say that the relative improvements in telomere length for Detroit blacks and Mexicans compared to whites after accounting for measured stressors suggest stronger autonomous protections for poor blacks and Mexicans than for whites. And so the influence of place on health is modified by the relationship of individual race ethnicity to the racial ethnic composition of the community and the contingencies of social identity that follow, and that spatially rooted social ties may be a protective resource for historically poor or marginalized groups. And that's very important because certainly some of the policy ideas is to disband and throw to the winds all the people who live in Detroit, you know, to deconcentrate poverty, as it's been called. And what I'm arguing is that there are real health and therefore probably other well-being benefits of being able to gain the autonomous protections and the cultural affirmation that may come by having strong social ties. And so I'll just, so the weathering research findings as a whole, they challenge this universal developmental view of age and health. They challenge essentialist interpretations of race, ethnicity, or poverty, whether they're genetic, cultural, or behavioral. They problematize simple notions of the social determinants of health. I think they highlight that as humans we share a basic biological canvas shaped by the interaction of structural location, place, and historical moment, which is what I refer to as the contingencies of social identity. And let's see. And so race, to answer my first question, race becomes biological through these structurally rooted but biopsychosocial processes. And I think this would suggest many different and multi-level levers for promoting health equity, including thinking about all social policy as health policy, and certainly immigration policy, if you think about that study, should be thought of as health policy. Environmental justice, I didn't get to talk about environmental issues in terms of the physical environment, but they're important. And then I've started a new concept called Jedi Public Health, which would be another talk in itself, but it aims to disrupt the discrediting and devaluing contingencies of social identity in everyday life so that at least some parts of weathering are disrupted. So I think that's it. Oops, yep, that's it.
Thank you, thank you. Do we want to just let them talk and save the conversation till after?
Yeah, I think that would be a good way.
So we'll hand the clicker over to Lauren Silver.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. It's such an honor to be here. I'm just really excited already by what I've heard, and I'm going to try to make some connections. It's also an honor to follow you, Arlene. I was telling her that I've known her work since my first semester in graduate school, which inspired me then and continues to inspire me to work around weathering and specifically looking at adolescent parents and young parents. So thank you very much for what you presented. And I've made some notes because I'm going to try to make connections, actually. So the paper that I shared with you and that I'll be briefly talking about, and really what I want to do today quickly is raise questions that I hope that we can return to and think about through our discussion, and questions that I think make some connections across our work, even though our work is from such sort of diverse disciplines. And so the paper is actually one that I co-authored with one of my graduate students, Janice Stiglich. And what I did, I wanted to return to the scenarios from my book. So I'm a feminist ethnographer, and my book, System Kids, is based on sort of multiple years of ethnography, but also based upon my memories of practice as a social worker with young, primarily Black mothers in a large urban child welfare system. And so the book, I claim that I'm a feminist ethnographer, and I'm not going to get into all the detail of why I do that, because it would be longer than my 10 minutes. But one thing that I do want to say today, because I think it connects to what you were saying earlier, John, I frame my work within a racial justice framework, or within a social justice framework. And I think oftentimes many of us will say that, but what does that mean? right? And so if we sort of unlearn like what we think we know about what justice is, what racial justice is, what are we really talking about when we say that we are researchers and we position ourselves within a racial justice framework? And so I've been thinking a lot about what that means, and that's definitely changed for me over time. So I'd be really interested in hearing from the rest of you, those of you who consider, you want your work to have impact on making, public health or making the world for young people more just, right? And so I hope that we can think about that some today. I've drawn upon, my book doesn't specifically look at use a reproductive justice framework, but I found it very interesting to use this framework to kind of re-look at some of what I found through my practice and through my research with young mothers. And I've also drawn upon Black girlhood studies. So again, in our discussion, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about why I found these frameworks so appealing. But what I'll say, very briefly, reproductive justice stems from Black feminists, and what it does is it allows us to consider not just reproductive decision making, but also family integrity. So, not only should women be able to decide when, how, why, how many, when they have children, but also should receive the sort of life circumstances and support to be able to take care of their families and to be able to have dignity and integrity. And so for me, I wanted to kind of shift my focus just from centering the young mothers to thinking more about family integrity, right? So the fathers, again, I don't have time to get into this, but the fathers were completely invisible in terms of the policy. And Arlene, this goes to what you were saying about oftentimes our policy is very disconnected from what is actually happening on the ground, especially in social work. Right? So this program that I looked at was a supervised independent living program for young mothers who were aging out of child welfare. The fathers weren't allowed to be there. They were there. Family members weren't allowed to be there officially, but they were there. However, because they were made invisible through the policy, there was no resources, no sort of cultural or symbolic sort of support to provide for the integrity of the family. The fathers had to be hidden. The domestic violence that was widespread in the families couldn't be addressed in any kind of systematic way. It was just sort of informal because they weren't supposed to be there. So young mothers and caseworkers were often involved in sort of hiding particular scenarios because of the stress put on them to maintain an impression of what would go with the policy. So just very briefly, my work sort of stems from this assumption, right, which I think many of ours does, that racism is pervasive. It is pervasive across all of U.S. institutions, historically and ongoing, right? And so all of the ways in which sort of other systems or policies have become, have made racism invisible, there's oftentimes these proxies for what is actually racism. And we see this in housing, we see this in education, we see this everywhere, really, through all of U.S. institutions. So what I wanted to do is, taking that as a given, and we can look both historically as well as across research at work that has documented those sort of state violence and these structural processes. What I wanted to understand, how is race lived? How is it embodied? How is it? How are these sort of structures? How do they become affect? How do they become felt and experienced through for the young women, but also for the caseworkers and through their interactions? And so the methodology that I used of ethnography and feminist ethnography in particular really allowed me to center, rather than to center an institutional perspective onto the young women, I could center the young women. So I could accompany them across public housing, across the healthcare system, across schooling. So I did. I shadowed, and I also advocated alongside these young women because of my social work background. So what I was able to do is to privilege and center their experiences, their identities, and the identity work, the strenuous work that it took to negotiate services and their own identities across these multiple system divides. Okay, and so the work really privileges and kind of looks at the creative, resistant forms and the ways in which young people kind of create dignity in the most impossible and violent spaces. Okay, so I want to move to, yes, right one, just some questions that I'm hoping that we can think a little bit more about today. So as a feminist, many feminists grapple with the role of the state in caring, particularly for Black families. And so when we look at the role of the state, we see tremendous violence, whether it's through forced sterilization, we see tremendous violence in many different ways. And so for me, I still hold out hope, I don't know why, that there is some sort of progressive, particularly a progressive role for government, right? And so I'm hoping that we can continue and grapple with what is the role for the state in caring for young families, or maybe young Black families in particular, or maybe it's not the state's function, but then where should it be? Where's the safety net? So I've always kind of returned to government because many of the young mothers, we talk about all the problems of the child welfare program we lived. They said without it, I'd be on the streets or I'd be dead. So we need to do better, but we also need to not destroy the safety net that we do have. So I hope that we can grapple with that today, the role of the state and government, particularly now as we move into this new era. Again, as I mentioned before, how is race lived affectively in the body and through subject positions? And what I mean, this is sort of a disciplinary subject position. What I mean is that for youth, they're always encountering categories that pre-exist them, right? For these young moms, they're Black girls, they're girls who've been abused or neglected in some sort of way, often in multiple ways, structurally as well as sort of interpersonally. They are mothers, they are teenagers, right? So they're occupying these positions and these assumptions that pre-exist them, right? They're pushing against many of these identity categories. Arlene, you mentioned identity safety, huge, right? Identity is huge, and so for these young people who are occupying these multiple identities and these positions that are punitively structured through race, through poverty, and through through their positioning, how are they dealing with that, right? And thinking particularly through social work, how do we challenge the sort of subject positions and the assumptions about who young mothers are? How do we challenge that? Because one of the things that I have recognized, having practiced social work, and this is this next point here about social work discourses and practices, individual responsibility was like the end-all be-all to everything. Everything was about let's make them autonomous, independent living. They need to be independent. Everybody wants to be self-sufficient and independent. However, the ways in which these discourses were applied was stigmatizing and was racist in many ways. And you can see that through some of the examples that I share in my paper. But particularly, individual responsibility in part meant separating the young women from the fathers, from extended family members, because these families were seen as deficit. They were seen as a problem, right? And so drawing from these discourses of individual responsibility, we ended up isolating, and we ended up breaking some of those social ties, Arlene, that you had mentioned that were pre-existing because of the assumptions about who these girls were, who their families were, right? That ended up, the policies ended up sort of, what's the word, getting in the way of what we wanted to do, the intentions of the work. So I think through social work, it's very easy, this is something anthropologically, it's very easy to take these sort of normative ideas of like individual responsibility, that's where it's at, but what does that really mean in our practices and how that plays out? So I'd love to talk about that a little bit more. And then finally, and I'll end at one more point after this, but age is a proxy for racism. And so Arlene, when you talked about preventing teenage pregnancy, like this has kind of, again, become very normative very normative. It's, the CDC is still one of their 7 top priorities, even though, teenage pregnancy has diminished greatly. So just started to kind of question, well, what is this really about? Is age sort of a convenient way to try to prevent a certain type of woman from having children? Poor women of color, right? And so I'm curious what you all think about this. Like, is age often used in our society as a proxy for racism, as a way to prevent particular type of women from having children, right? Okay, and then finally, I'd like to think about, I like this concept of boundary spanning, because this is something that social work has done and is so sort of positioned to do. It's the moving in between communities, right? And we talk about advocacy, right? And I'm really interested in thinking about how do we think about advocacy more collectively. So as a social worker, I did tons of advocacy with young mothers, but it was always within the punitive rules of the system, right? How could we kind of break the rules a little bit or push a little here, a little, but the system continued to operate in its punitive form. So I want to think a little differently about what we might mean in, as researchers, communicating our work to movements on the ground. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter has been partnered with many of the reproductive justice organizations that I've been looking at. But I'd like to see sort of our work as being in conversation more with movements on the ground, but also with policymakers. So I'm very happy to be here because I'm interested in, how we can kind of continue to span boundaries. Because I think that is sort of essential. Particularly, I'm thinking about Obama's farewell address, in which he mentioned that racism happens in between all of our bubbles, right? In between the sort of the ivory towers and the zones, the segregated zones. And so if we could think about boundary spanning through social work, but also through the relationship between research social work, and movement building, I think that would be helpful and interesting to me. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Starting right off, my paper concerns racial profiling, black male stigma, and social work practice. And what I do is I use the Trayvon Martin study as a way of demonstrating the problems of stigma amongst black males. And also talk about the deleterious effects of racial profiling on black males. Everybody knows about the Trayvon Martin case, August 2012. A young man, 17 years old, in Stanford, Florida, walking to the store to get some Skittles and a soda pop, was followed by a guy named George Zimmerman, who called himself a neighborhood watchman, self-imposed, who radioed the police and then said, this guy looks like he's up to no good. The police asked him to stop following him. But he did. An altercation ensued, and what we know then, Trayvon Martin was shot and killed with a weapon. But the stigma of black males starts off right off top. One is that he's up to no good. George Zimmerman says the magic words that we've seen across the country, particularly since that time when black males have been killed. I feared for my life. So that's part of the stigma of black males as dangerous, aloof, ready to engage in possible criminal activity at any time. And so one thing is to look at this from a race-centered perspective and critical race theory. And a race-centered perspective basically says that race is central to America, and a basic assumption of the race-centered perspective is that a key function of American social policy development and implementation is social control. The policies and practices that emerge from the underlying assumptions of social control are understood as having regulatory intentions and results that aim to monitor and change behaviors of those deemed socially deviant and politically threatening. Black males seem very politically threatening. In fact, the empowerment of black males has been very problematic in this country since its conception. Control of black male bodies starts early. As I told you, my research is around African American males and socialization. When I look at the data on preschools, black youth, male and female, are 16% of children in daycare, but they are 48% of the kids suspended from daycare. And they are 48% of the kids put in restraints in daycare. And so we really start that whole notion of control very early in life. And that's very problematic for black males who social workers engage in a therapeutic relationship with, because they're just basically untrusting of the system. If you can imagine being placed in restraints somewhere from 3 to 5, and what that does to the trajectory of the rest of your life. And so I talk about that in the paper. The other thing is very interesting is that when I started out this project with some friends of mine that are on the paper, we did a kind of systematic review, and we found no research in social work on black male stigma. It's just amazing how we engage in that way. And based on the last two speakers, and particularly the last one where she said racism is pervasive, I actually believe that America is a racist country. We just bathe ourselves in racism, and it impacts all of us. I almost wanted to start a support group like AAA where people stand up and say, I am a racist, and I'd be the first one to do it. Racism has many definitions, but it is not all about power. It is about our mental state of thinking and perceiving how people interact and engage each other in a social context. Racial profiling, we all know about that. There are a lot of definitions of it, but it is really very problematic in terms of shaping our perceptions and behaviors about people. And, you know, people on the right have said, particularly in New York, where Mayor Giuliani had the broken windows technique, they said they cleaned up the city, but it's been fraught with problems. If we just look at the data recently, just look at the data on racial profiling, what we find is this. Blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans are stopped more than any other group, particularly blacks lead that. When they are, and blacks and Hispanics and Native Americans are more likely to have their cars searched when they are stopped. Whites are less likely to have their cars searched. But when they are searched, contraband is more so found from our Anglo-American brothers and sisters, that is guns or weapons or drugs, are found in their cars more so than blacks or Hispanics or Native Americans. So it's very problematic. Part of the stigma of black males starts with the war on poverty. In many ways, if we go back to the 1970s and look at a testimony that came from John Ehrlichman of the Nixon administration, who Nixon started the war on drugs at a time when drug use was starting to abate. And if we look historically at all the drug laws about illegal drugs in our country, they basically start with the demonization of black males. Sigmund Freud wrote in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1940, like, cocaine is the greatest thing I've ever seen. You know, it really makes me engage in socialization. I mean, socializing with people. I'm not drunk or inebriated like alcohol, so it's great. But it was when the country demonized black males as possibly snorting cocaine and then raping white women that it became illegal. So on with marijuana, with heroin and other drugs. We've seen that also. And so that's been very problematic. Now, one of the challenges of stigma is that we say that we are a colorblind society. And if we look at the Trayvon Martin case, the judge said that I'm not going to allow race to taint this trial. But that's problematic because we have these presuppositions about race in the first place and the way the jury pool was chose. And I really had to stop watching the whole thing because we had this 170-pound boy, this 200-pound man, and people were up there testifying about how great little Georgie was. And they demonized Trayvon Martin. But back to what happened in terms of this whole notion of race as a challenge in the 70s in the war on drugs. What Ehrlichman said was, and this was just released in March of 2016, It's from a 22-year-old testimony interview with him. He said, we, that is the Nixon administration, knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war on drugs, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both, we could disrupt these communities, those communities. Did we know that we were lying about drugs? Of course we did, unquote. And so they knew that they were lying the whole time, sets forth the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration of black folks based on drugs. And then we saw what happened particularly in the 1990s in terms of crack cocaine and the conceptualization of that. So my central point here is that black male stigma was really well at play in the Trayvon Martin narrative. And it's really witnessed by the way he was characterized during the trial. So for example, if we look, we find that during the trial, as I said, the judge declared that we couldn't have race. But one of the things I wanted to read from my paper is this. Where's that at? Well, I'll just say this. You know, the prosecutor brought a piece of cement into the courtroom, a piece of, and he said that the weapon that Trayvon Martin used was the sidewalk. And so because, you know, he was kind of bashing George Zimmerman's head into the concrete with that. And, you know, that was very problematic because it plays on these racial stereotypes about Martin as a dangerous person. And, you know, it is very problematic in terms of a jury pool seeing this and then how stigma plays out, which led to the no guilty verdict for George Zimmerman. I'm still trying to find the particular piece in my paper where I wrote that. But anyway, if we look at social work profession in terms of that, there are a couple of things that need to happen in terms of that. One, if we are going to engage in practice with African American families, we have to discuss the centrality of racial profiling and race in dealing with black families. And we have to admit up front that it is a problem and that black males do have a problem in terms of their perception in society. And so the whole notion that there's this level playing field and there's equality and that these civil rights laws were out there for you still has not abated race from our society. And black and social workers really need to understand more about the lived experience of black males. And now there's some researchers that have suggested that if we use African American clinicians, that may be helpful. But that's no panacea because many African Americans are trained in K through 12 education systems as well as university systems. And as I've said to students for so long, I have about 300 college credits. You wouldn't know I knew anything about race if you looked at my transcripts. That is something I've had to study on my own, and there's not much within social work that gave me a lot concerning that. And in social work, if we look, there's only one race center to my knowledge within the profession. That's Larry Davis's race center at the University of Pittsburgh. So while there is a lot of talk about it, there's a lot of talk about what we'll do about the recent killing of African American males. There's just not a lot of research that we put into it. So we know very little, but we have a lot of empathy for it. So we really don't know what to do. And so that is very problematic also. I talked about this. Clinicians working with black families must gain a sense of their lived experience and operating in society where stigma and implicit bias are commonplace. Acknowledging that racial profiling is a clear and present occurrence is important, and that those who experience such occurrence may experience psychological trauma and other complications. If they're in domestic violence groups, they're much less likely to volunteer, much more likely to be court appointed, and more likely to not participate because of that. Social work education programs and university can work with local agencies and organizations within communities that have histories of racial profiling and poor relationship with local law enforcement. We've seen some of that coming out of these mass shootings. In St. Louis, you have the Clockwork Tower Accords, where The university is working with the neighborhood, working with local agencies to empower people to find jobs for black males. But students push that. The killing of the person by the university policeman at the University of Cincinnati really got the students united there. And while they were laughed at, they have pushed for several demands and made several changes. Now, some of my research through the National Association of Deans and Social Workers, I surveyed them to look at their focus within their curriculum on such things as race, diversity, structural inequalities, with the assumption that we would see less, there would be lower scores in terms of discussions about structural inequalities and more about diversity, multiculturalism, feminist perspective, etc. What we found there with my research assistant was no significance in the data. I'll be talking about that at NAD at our next meeting, John. But there was a lot of, because it was a qualitative data collection, there were a lot of things that were said about communities demanding that social work education programs engage in more outreach as it pertains to challenges within the community. But the communities where these shootings took place, that was more likely where the professor spoke up, and there was more of an outroar from the communities and the students there. So again, advocacy has real meaning. I think one of the real challenges for the social work profession is, and I said this to my colleagues at NAD, is that we say that we are advocates, but then when something happened, most of the officials within the major organizations have said, well, we're scholars and our place is in the academy. And we cannot have it both ways. Students are very angry about being told that they will understand how to advocate for change within the communities, and then programs don't show them how to engage in community organization. Had a recent conversation with Darla Coffey, the president of CSWE, and I said, that is a salient factor. She agreed with me. I told her that the problem was much deeper than that, because our license in social work is pegged basically to clinical practice. If you don't understand clinical practice, then you won't get a license. Only 6% of social workers engage in macro practice, and I just happen to be one of those myself. And so if the profession is serious about reducing stigma of black males, serious about community organization, and serious about having students understand the link between structural inequalities and everyday ordinary clinical practice, then it's going to have to make a change out in there.
Thanks, Martel. And rounding out the morning, Eric Guerrero.
Thank you, John. I don't have slides. Okay. Well, this is a very rich discussion, and I'm certainly appreciative, again, Associate Dean Short for and the organizing committee for your invitation to this timely discussion on race and equality. What I'm going to try to do is kind of highlight the role of the organization in this conversation as we think of how organizations think about race, how do they respond to race, and in particular, I'm going to focus in behavioral health. Although this conversation should not be constrained by geographical boundaries, my contribution will focus on race and equality in the United States, which is how we're situating this conversation at this point. We certainly can have a rich discussion focused solely on our country, considering the current anxiety about the immediate future of race relations and the degree to which every community has equal access to opportunities to realize its full potential. We certainly have heard compelling evidence of the threats to equality for individuals and communities. And so far, kind of a lot of the themes have been how the individual kind of fares. And still, we're kind of alluding to all these contextual factors, right? Communities, government, policies that somehow have a role in this kind of distribution of health outcomes, or how individuals respond to this weathering hard or policies about family planning or, criminal justice. And all of these certainly are managed through institutions and organizations that could be kind of agents of change or agents of control. We have heard organizations, especially like human service organizations that work closely with social workers that include hospitals, social service agencies, libraries, connect the individual with society, and as such can be leveraged to improve the social development and the well-being of communities. I will discuss a threat to equality in access to addiction treatment. African American and Latino populations have rates of addiction that are similar to those in general population. Yet, they are less likely to receive addiction treatment or have positive outcomes when they receive treatment. For decades, policymakers and service providers have struggled to address these racial and ethnic disparities in access to care with little success. Generally, 1 in 10 individuals from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds seeking care successfully engages in treatment. Because the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, has provided more people with health coverage that includes addiction treatment services and expanded coverage to previously uninsured populations, which much of this number is represented by African Americans and Latinos, it has become critical for policymakers to ensure this population actually enters and stays in treatment for whatever time they need. However, this is an area in which the new administration is threatening equal access to care, primarily via its stated intention to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. To provide a backdrop to my remarks, let me share some empirical findings from our latest study, which was funded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse and seeks to inform evidence-based approaches to increasing access to care for low-income Latino and African Americans in LA County. This study draws from a large project with unique primary panel data collected from 2011 to 2016 from a pretty large sample of treatment organizations, 120, in what constitutes one of the largest treatment systems in the country. This is kind of merged with about 8,000 individuals served per year who receive treatment from these organizations to primarily explore this relationship between organizational characteristics of these treatment programs and client treatment outcomes. So this notion of disparity certainly is the kind of is kind of at the other end of the equality spectrum, right? When we see differences. But these individual differences have been primarily targeted in basically representing target populations, unintentionally reinforcing a message that disparities in care are due to differences among individuals. And somehow, when we do the statistics that we were talking about last night, sometimes the media or the public kind of maybe blames the individual and said, it is because of your education, it is because of your probability to enter certain schools or certain services, that it is your fault that you are not completing treatment successfully. Certainly, the disparities research has focused primarily on individual differences. For example, blaming Latinos' lower completion of treatment on differences in Latinos' education or income level, or higher tendency to binge drink. And not account for the fact that disparities are also explained by the characteristics of healthcare organizations from which they receive care. Emerging evidence suggests that Latinos, for instance, receive lower quality care than whites because they're more likely to receive care from treatment organizations with lower capacity to provide such care. These are smaller programs with fewer staff members, fewer hours or more restricted hours of operation, fewer supportive services, and less availability of evidence-based practice. These smaller organizations are typically located in minority communities, and interestingly, have a similar history of neglect and disenfranchisement as the communities they serve. So we elevate this notion of the individual in its kind of ethnic role to organizations that are somehow racialized because of their constitution or where they are located. This raises issues, of course, to connect race, ethnicity, socioeconomics, community, and organizational capacity to healthcare quality and effectiveness. As an example of the relationships among funding resources, internal organizational assets, and their impact on client outcomes, our study found that, for instance, organizations that accept Medicaid payments have shorter wait times for clients seeking to enter addiction treatment. So certainly certain revenues coming from government are associated with higher access to care for Latinos and African Americans in this case. Organizations with staff environments that are conducive to change, for instance, are able to keep clients in treatment for longer periods of time. Attribute typically an organization that is more of a learning organization, kind of manages, is agile, and responds to the care and the service needs of its main population, target population. And inevitably, you think, well, if we kind of send some of these Latinos to a high capacity programs, what would happen? Would this gap, would this disparity disappear? Well, indeed, we found that high capacity organizations that have a combination of ability to build Medicaid, revenue coming, directors whose leadership style supports intellectual stimulation and innovation, and environments conducive to staff readiness for change, are more likely to report Latinos and African Americans that have shorter wait times. That is, they wait fewer days to enter treatment, which in addiction, as you know, is necessary, as well as to stay in treatment long enough to derive benefit from this intervention. So having to wait for treatment is one of the most significant barriers to treatment in addiction. And the longer individuals stay in treatment, the better their chances of experiencing positive treatment outcomes. So this is an example, an empirical example of how inequality could be transformed and kind of reproduced in the interaction among minority communities and their treatment organizations. Therefore, organizational factors such as obtaining a Medicaid license and accepting Medicaid payments, building environments that are conducive to staff change, and building strong leadership behaviors among treatment experts can and do affect critical patient-level outcomes in addiction treatment programs, particularly that serve Latinos and African Americans. Policymakers and program directors need to be aware of these specific organizational leverage points that can be used to improve equal access to care for members of racial and ethnic minority groups. So this is the empirical part. But now that raises questions in terms of how do we answer this question about how do these empirical findings inform our conversation today on the role of race as a social construct with political, cultural, medical, and structural implications. These are 4 quick thoughts. Building capacity at the organizational level to improve equity in racial and ethnic minority communities requires reducing the gap within and between organizations in their technical and cultural capacity to deliver care, right? You have to be better within, because it's not like organizations are homogeneous in all of their members thinking the same way, right? But also across an organizational field. In the coming years, the values and visions of organizational leaders will likely be challenged by the rhetoric and funding priorities that seek to ignore and divorce cultural and economic ability from human service provision. Here's where critical race theorists, social work scholars, practitioners, and communities need to come together to frame challenges, elevate priorities, and ensure investment in communities, partly through funding critical social programs. We want to also avoid the example of the film industry, just to pick on them because they are here and they're in Hollywood, which compared to the commitment of culturally responsive human service organizations to diversity in representation and quality of services, has made limited progress in hiring diverse populations and advancing or promoting diversity. And we have an expert right there, Rafael Angulo. For instance, how unequal and unfair would it feel for a community to be blatantly ignored in daily life? This is the case in most blockbuster films that so blatantly ignore race relations, and other aspects of race. I won't pick on any single film, but the next time you watch a movie made in Hollywood, please consciously consider, for instance, how many Latinos are introduced in the movie, what roles they serve, what message is being delivered. Despite representing, to kind of make it very obvious, despite representing more than half of the population in Los Angeles, Latinos appear in less than 5% of the movies. An appalling statistic revealed in studies conducted by one of our colleagues here, Dr. Stacy Smith and colleagues from Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. And when they do appear, they typically are featured in stereotypical immigrant, gang-affiliated, low-income roles. We know that although there's some segmentation across communities within a city, day-to-day life is much more diverse than this. Mexican Americans in middle income and professional classes represent more than 35% of this population. And yet, media represents this group mainly as undocumented, low-income individuals with little education. Interracial marriages account for more than 12% of all marriages in the United States. And whites marry Latinos 3 times more often than any other group, showing a very different reality of race-ethnic interactions. Systematically excluding a large group of people from mainstream representation or demeaning their contribution to the lives of middle to high-class individuals, that is, non-Hispanic white society that is represented in some of these kind of Hollywood films, in day-to-day life can be considered one of the most significant threats to equity and social justice. For multiple industries, some industries and organizations will continue this path, ignoring the role of certain groups, in part due to support from critical political views and agendas that we're going to hear more this afternoon. But in terms of social work scholarship, the schools of social work need to promote education and research and evidence-based macro practices that can create change among institutions that ignore populations. From my colleague Murali and I, who really marshaled and put together a book on this topic to train social workers in the workplace, we can say that it is through really going beyond the direct practice in the training of social workers and others that really give some leverage to social workers to really move at different levels. Really be at tables in which decisions are made to build resources to support the most vulnerable group in society. And taking big steps like energizing community-based organizations to create social movements capable of trumping inadequate leaders. The call for action is for new and experienced social workers and scholars who move beyond direct practice again, and that are bolstered by a strong conviction and commitment to equality and justice. So the social innovation of the 21st century, it's models of capacity building that move beyond the individual, move into communities and organizations embedded in those communities that bind diverse people together with a clear promise to support growth and health in all communities. So, a few thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. And thanks to all of the panelists who started us off. I think we got going in a really provocative and helpful way. I have tons of questions, comments. I think what I'll do is maybe just throw the barn door open to begin with and see what people are thinking, what folks have found most valuable. There are tons of ways I think you can imagine tensions between and among some of the positions, nice through lines as well. One question I have at the back of my head that at some point maybe I'll bother to ask in a more formal way, although I'll hold off on it, is, what are the differences and similarities between and among the papers, presentations, projects, and perspectives around what we think race can and can't explain and how it does that work, and in conjunction with what other categories of difference and change are and all that stuff. But what are you all thinking? What jumps out to the folks at the table, John?
So I was struck by a comment that Lauren made when she started her presentation about one of our goals is to make the world more just, and certainly that underlies the social work profession. But whether it's being naive or whether it's tuning in to what has been a longstanding discussion on the topic of race, I wonder what that means to be more just. I can imagine two possible conceptualizations of that phrase. One is relative to other groups, or relative to some absolute standard that applies to all people. And the reason why I think that distinction is important is because it really gets to the issue of the intractability or inevitability of racism on the one hand, and the way that social workers respond to it or mobilize not just the profession but the community at large in responding to it, dealing with it, ending with it, perhaps most importantly, deciding on what that goal should be as a way of then determining what the appropriate response is. So, when I was listening to Arlene's presentation, I began to think about the fact that on the one hand, you can see clear racial, ethnic differences in telomere length and the implications of weathering on health. On the other hand, we're all kind of, regardless of ethnicity, we're all subject to the fact that telomere length is a function of age, and as we grow older, we're all dealing with that. So it's, in a way, an illustration of the fact that both of those conceptualizations of more just enter into the issue of health disparities. And then when I began to listen to the presentation about racial profiling, it got me thinking, and there were a number of conversations that emerged out of the Trayvon Martin case. One is the fact that racial profiling is harmful to certain segments of the population, but racial profiling is harmful to all segments of the population, because by virtue of having those attitudes, one inevitably limits themselves to perspectives that otherwise might be of self-benefit. And in much the same way that there's literature that has made the argument that racism can be harmful to the dominant society just as much as it is to other populations. So then I began to think in terms of response or action. If you were to say to whites about the harms of racial profiling, or any of these outcomes for that matter, whether it relates to perinatal outcomes or outcomes associated with aging, trying to perhaps communicate where all people have, for lack of a better way of describing it, skin in the game, an investment in ending racism, an investment in ending inequality. Does it, are you more likely to achieve that by talking about justice in terms of an absolute standard, or by talking about it in terms of one group relative to another?
I understand perfectly what you're saying, Larry. I think what this morning has also shown is that the nature of racial inequality. And I think that seems to be the key. We know that race is socially constructed. The question that we should ask is, for what purpose, really? I think that demonstrates something to us that in all aspects of what we are discussing across the board, there's racial inequality existing. And yet we know that race is a biological system. It's not something that, it's not a biological system, I'm sorry.
Sure.
It's not a biological system. It's one that has been imposed. And so, therefore, it gives it a different perspective in my thinking. And hearing what you're saying, and Aileen and Lauren and Eric, I think that what comes to mind is the whole nature of the categorization, that every aspect of our lives are categorized through race, in effect. And therefore, by doing that, has stigmatized us and receive the point you are making, Martel, about the issue of Trayvon Martin. I mean, that is so clearly identified that was race playing out to the audience, in effect, and the issue that presents itself in court, where people again was looking at race. So therefore, my question is, how do we actually deal with something that is socially constructed rather than a biological factor, as we know that it isn't? And I think that is a question that we should be placing on the table.
Yeah. Let me speak here, just particularly to your point. Let's get into that. I finally found the part in my paper. It says, black male stigma was well at play in the Trayvon Martin narrative, as witnessed by the characterization of Martin by the legal defense team during the trial. The presuppositions were set long before his encounter with George Zimmer. Suspiciously pursued and armed with a sidewalk, a piece of cement was literally brought into the courtroom by the defense attorney during the trial. Martin was transformed from the embodiment of black male stigma, based on his very existence, from his extended rights of his American citizenship, and simply walking down the street to a hood-wearing attacker who lashed out and assaulted citizen George Zimmer. At the outset of the trial, the judge said that it had to be a colorblind trial. But consequently, in playing fast and loose with the myriad of narrow stereotypes, a local jury and a national audience, the defense attorney depicted the 17-year-old, 158-pound Martin as a violent gangbanger who attacked the 200-pound Zimmerman. Clearly, the rub on injustice is not only the non-guilty verdict rendered in the George Zimmerman trial, but the fact that Trayvon Martin was at once classified as criminal by default, even as he was the victim of unnecessary lethal violence. According to legal scholar and activist Patricia Williams, the attempt was to resurrect Trayvon Martin during the trial as the active participant in his own death. So the challenge of, when you ask the question of what we achieve more by discussing this in this inclusivity about all groups and the problem of race instead of just one. Yes, but the challenge in social work, we talk about intersectionality of problems. And if we look in history, particularly at the Civil Rights Movement, subsequent groups kind of piggybacked off of that as well as they should. Then there was a movement by Cesar Chavez in the South here about what was going on with our Latino brothers and sisters. But my point there is that feminists, gay and lesbians, all piggybacked off the Civil Rights Movement, but the challenges for Black America were still there. And if we look at the development of our country, it was really set up structurally at the demise of African Americans. Du Bois talks about this in his Black Reconstruction. And he basically says that, and Black folk get into this whole notion about the best of us survived in the Middle Passage and all that. People need to get away from that. I mean, if you were in the hold of a ship, it was by luck of who got there. And my point is that there was never any intention of getting rid of Black Americans, but as Du Bois said, to make us servants for the world. And I still think that is at play in the structure of American society. And so part of it is a call for reparations, but not money, but for the people who did this to repair themselves in terms of what they did and the morally demonstrative destruction of people and the longitudinal problem that is caused and what this society needs to do to rectify it. We're going to have to deal with that. So if we got, I got 4 children, and all of them come from me and their mother, but they have unique challenges. And so my son doesn't necessarily want to hear what I did with my daughter. He has his own set of unique challenges. And when we look at health disparities, if we look at medicine, race is very problematic. But we do know certain things, like our Jewish brothers and sisters are more likely to have Tay-Sachs disease, sickle cell anemia more likely belongs to African Americans, and so we have to adjust. So race has some saliency there. So when we get to social policy, so when I was in Florida and I saw Stand Your Ground policy come out, I go, okay, Black folk got a problem. They got a problem, because I understand how that extends to us. And we need to not only look at the intended consequences of policy, but the unintended consequences of policy. That is what they said in North Carolina recently when they were engaging in voting rights. And the court said, the circuit court said, this is intended right at African Americans. And so until we grapple with it in those ways, we're still having the same problem. But at the same time, there still is this intersectionality of problems. I hope that helps.
This idea about what constitutes justice and whether, for example, racial profiling constitutes injustice really gets us at the heart of the question, because there are a lot of people who don't see any racial injustice in racial profiling. Zip, zero, zilch. When Jesse Jackson says to an all-black Chicago congregation, nothing more troubles me at this point in my life than to walk down the street, start hearing suspicious footsteps and thinking robbery, turn around seeing a white face and feeling relieved. And everybody there got what he meant. There's a statistically rational relationship, sadly, between race and risk of street crime. Street crime. I'm talking about street crime. Now, there are a lot of other kind of crimes, yeah. Drug use, please. All groups are about the same. Street crime, you can count the toe tags, you can really figure out the differences in street crime, armed robberies, etc. Right? The sad reality is you take a group of people, disproportionately concentrate them in desperate circumstances, it's sad but not surprising to find them disproportionately turn to desperate undertakings like crime. So someone can say I'm racially profiling not out of any racial animus, but because there's a statistically rational relationship between race and a factor that I get to consider in a self-defense claim, which is again how these cases come up. It's not America is oppressing black people from 100 to 50, 150 years ago into today, and we see it in the Trayvon Martin case. No, what happened in the Trayvon Martin case is the judge gave the jury an instruction, as he does or she does in every self-defense case, based on the reasonable person standard. That is the standard to which everything is related, by which everything is measured in a self-defense case, right? And what that standard says is, the ordinary person is the reasonable person. If you look into a mirror, it tells the jury, and you see George Zimmerman gazing back at you, you must acquit. That's what the instructions tell them. That's what the instructions told the Simi Valley jury that acquitted the Rodney King beaters the first time around, right? So it's not just George Zimmerman, it's society. The jury is telling us how society views black men and black folk. And they're being a vehicle, a conduit for those social attitudes and social beliefs and expressions of the social feelings about black people, right? And so it's, and we can come back, I'll come back this when we're trying to connect all of these together and come back around to, you know, how this shifts our focus from individual wrongdoing or individual internal deficiencies to macro level social factors that are really driving a lot of these outcomes. And that's what I hear everyone coming back to again and again. You can explain predicaments and you can explain human behavior either on the basis of internal factors, deficiencies, pathologies, moral shortcomings, or on the basis of external factors, you know, a lack of jobs, lack of health care, lack of proper schooling, and we just, you know, which way you decide you're going to explain human behavior is going to have a big impact on what your solutions are.
Just really quickly, and from a psychological standpoint, the difference is when you say internal or external, which one comes faster to your mind?
Right. Attribution error.
Attribution error. So internal ones are easy, they're quick, they're predisposed. External ones you have to explain, well, okay, how much do they really make, where do they live, what happened here? So when you talk about the reaction to these things in terms of a social and societal way, individuals make up the society, and individuals on average process information the same way, and they process their internal predispositions much faster than they do external ones. So you're going to see these things over and over. We do it the same.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's true, but I think also that if you blame it on the internal factors, then you sort of get around the issue of providing the economic support that is needed in those communities that have been historically oppressed, right? Because that was the struggle of Martin Luther King in 1968 when he was trying to get economic justice and not just justice under the law, because he himself said that was cheap. It didn't cost society anything. Right. So it's when we actually start imposing those costs on society, I think, where you see that shift, and where during that time there was that shift in terms of whether or not we're going to acknowledge the historical factors or if we're going to turn it into this cultural pathology argument, because that's what was argued then, right? So I think we have to be aware of that as well.
And the attribution here you mentioned is aggravated when it comes to race. People more readily attribute wrongdoing to the internal factors when it comes to blacks than whites, even though there's a general bias. And when you're looking at the population, attribute behavior to internal factors and external, it gets ratcheted up. And racial differentials in how we explain human behavior, whether an internal or external factor.
Just Jackson does all those things you talked about, but he still has the attribution error. So many people do. We can't control how our brains work in that way. We acknowledging things that exist is one thing, but in the moment, we rely on our human instincts and human nature. So that is a challenge, right? That is the reality of it.
So, but something I thought was interesting that I heard throughout the presentations that were brought up at various points were how certain stereotypes or images are consistently portrayed in society that might actually impact that bias as well, right? Or might keep people from moving past that bias, right? Like the media, if you're constantly seeing, there's been a number of social psychology research that has that's found that, you know, African Americans and other minorities are disproportionately shown as the villain, whereas whites are disproportionately shown as sort of the savior, the cops, or the victims. And so if you see, and individuals who watch, for example, news actually have more bias than folks who don't, because they're constantly seeing these images, right?
It's the highest rated black African American show.
Right now?
Show?
Is it Blackish?
You mean currently?
Currently, it is now. Blackish is more recent, but it was the reality shows.
Oh, right.
Cable television. So you talk about the
reinforcement of stereotypes.
Producers did that, even though you have folks in the show. So.
Well, what's interesting, a lot of us, I feel, are saying sort of the same thing. I think what's important for us today is to also see the linkage between them. One thing, you know, this idea of justice, a couple of things I wanted to say. I always, for my own work, I always link it to what Martin Luther King said. Until the laws of man equal those of a higher power, we'll never have a socially just world, you know? So that's usually what I rely upon myself to guide me in my research. But what hearing about, you know, from what you were discussing with what we see, how the media reinforcing, you know, I like to rely on the work of looking at what, you know, Joseph Fagan had mentioned when he talks about how we have this white racial frame that was set up intentionally, this system, to help support this economic growth of the country from 1619, the first Dutch flagship that arrived. And things have been reinforced. You know, we talk about we can't change psychology, but actually we can, because what we're seeing now is nothing but something that's been passed down through the generations, transgenerational ideas. And many of us walk by with these ideas when we see these people of color or of whatever stature, this automatic, as you talk about, this internal. But that internal also creates policies, programs, sets up conditions where people, like you talk about, Jody, are in a closed system, economic depravity, where they act in such a way as replicated in what they have. So we're talking about really a lot of linkages. But I think the overarching thing, I think we all can agree on a lot of things we're talking about. What's next? Because the people we're talking about training, whether it be in law, whether it be in social work, public policy, the people we're talking about training, they have no idea this stuff. They're not inundated with it within their curriculum. They're not inundated upon gatherings. So they go out and work with these communities. They also continue to transcend this stuff they brought. And you have this fight, advocacy versus what's happening internally. What do we do next? Because these are the people who are going to be affecting policy. These are the people who are going to be affecting the policy within institutions, but also maybe at the federal and state, local government. What do we do with that?
I think also that it touches on the socialization processes. I think that, you know, my thinking around this is that racism doesn't just touch us as black people. It actually touches white people too. And I think that the interesting phenomena is that it's always looked upon us as if it's our problem, and therefore we are the culprit in it. That's why it brings me back to the idea of racial inequality, because all the things in our system, like what Terence is actually saying really, is that if you look at it, there's so many injustice, and or then you get the colorblind issue, which is almost pile on top of the injustice. And so it's hard then to actually mobilize yourself out of that system itself, because a social worker, say, working in a community and don't understand all the implications of what's actually going on, might take the colorblind aspects of life and think that's fine. I mean, these things are things that schools like the School of Social Work should be educating their professional people to understand that, you know, if you're working with people in society, you've got to recognize these things as consequences of their lives and things that can make a difference to them we need to do. I mean, all these things are sort of wrapped up quite tightly. And it's not just in America, by the way, because I come from Britain, and the argument is virtually the same. I can't identify anything that is different. Social justice is the same argument that we use. Racism, we know it's socially constructed. I mean, when it suits people, they say that, you know, black people's brains are smaller than white. I mean, that was, you know, not so long ago. We, in Britain, had to get rid of a political person for actually saying that. I mean, you know, this is not a new phenomena. I think that what we should be trying to do is to let other people understand the serious nature of the implications, not just on our day-to-day living, but also our health and our well-being, our children's health, you know, the community that we live in. Why are we going to prison at a higher rate than everybody else? Not just in America, by the way, also in other Western countries. So why don't we look across the board as well? And you can see that there is something that's not right when you're looking at social justice and what we need to do as people who understand what's happening.
You have a lot of people look at all those people in prison, though, and say they're in there because of their own damn fault. They make bad decisions. I don't buy this new Jim Crow stuff. They'll say Jim Crow was about innocent Negroes suffering social oppression. You know, Martin, Medgar, and Rosa. You know, it wasn't blacks making bad choices, preying on some of the most vulnerable members of their own community and winding up in the joint. They say, I don't see the moral equivalence between Medgar, Martin, and Rosa on the one hand, a gangbanger, a drug dealer, and a prostitute on the other. I don't get it. Right? And they'll go right back to that. We can explain social phenomena on the basis of internal factors, internal deficiencies in the populations we're concerned about, rather than macro level external social determinants that you talk about. I see this thread running through everybody. We can wash our collective hands of responsibility if we can blame it on individuals and their internal deficiencies. And so you see us constantly looking for maneuvers that we can pull off to do that as a collective, you know, as a collectivity.
But then think about who's in prison. It's the poor, largely African American. So then it comes back to that economic argument, because, you know, research has shown that you can fight crime better with education, and especially early childhood education, than you can with incarcerating individuals. But when you ask people how they want to fight crime, and you ask them, for example, you say, well, do you want to fight crime with educational programs, or do you want to fight crime with prison? And so crime in general, they say, I want the education, I want social programs to help with crime in general. When you ask them about urban crime, they say they want to build prisons. So really we're getting back to a social choice that is being made, and that's what the current research is actually showing empirically about mass incarceration, is that it was public policy, not changes in criminal behavior, not drugs, crack cocaine epidemic. It wasn't all of those other things, the institutionalization of mental institutions. None of those things were what really drove incarceration rates. It was really public policy, truth in sentencing laws, all these things that led to a greater flow of individuals in prison and increased the stock of individuals in prison, right? But it still comes back to, I think, the social determinants, right? But it's really educating society, because maybe they don't know that, or maybe they're making certain decisions about how they want to deal with certain segments of the population. And maybe it's about education, but what type of education? Is it about education on race and the historical, like how we're influenced by our stereotypes and how that might impact our decisions about how we choose to do things? Or is it, it's really hard to determine where to start. I sort of think it's accepting as a country and a society that we are driven by these racial stereotypes, but I'm interested to hear what everyone else.
Well, I think, Larry, you have a point in terms of one way of couching this in terms of how it impacts all of us and the cost. But to my chagrin and to all of us, here we are in a state where per capita more money is spent on incarcerating people than it is per person and putting someone through K-12 education. And America knows that, but still we engage in this intervention instead of prevention, which gets back to the socialization of people in K-12 schools.
Yep.
And we see a narrative that runs through there. So in Texas, they've even taken, they stopped Latinos from even talking about the books. They brought in a whole nother set of people to tell about the history of Latinos, which is very skewed. They've taken Thomas Jefferson even out of the textbooks. And so the narrative that we're getting through K-12 education and the socialization process sets us up for this. So sometimes I'm cynical about it, but we've invoked Martin Luther King, and one of the things he said is, "The world would end tomorrow, I would plant my seed today." So that means that hope is eternal, and so I really do have hope. And if we know history, there was a time when we didn't have this in this country or worldwide, and that has shifted, particularly since the Enlightenment era in the 17th century. So how do we grapple with that for the future is the task for all of us.
And I think also, jumping off what you were saying about, when you look at someone and say it's your own damn fault, that means you can't put yourself in that person's shoes. Like the prostitute is other, right? The prostitute, the drug dealer is other. Like it's their own damn fault. And so I feel like there has to be a way of, and I think it is through education, of humanizing. But for, I would be that prostitute if I had, that sort of, how do you teach kids to recognize that, you might be that person if you were in that person's shoes, and how do you, and I think, part of the problem is because of the education system and the segregation. I teach a civic engagement urban education class, and I had a student say to me, I went to school, but I wasn't educated. I went, and she's like, she was practically in tears saying, why didn't I learn about this? Why did I go K-12 and I never learned about this? This being, some of what we're talking about, like the ways in which these structural inequalities become ingrained in our bodies and everything, right? And so I think, it's obviously going to be multi-pronged, but we have to figure out ways of humanizing one another, right? Because if you can see yourself having been that prostitute, if you had different circumstances, then you can move from the, it's your own damn fault to, okay, right? We've set this up in such a way that people are positioned into these categories.
And I think that's the cost of racism, is that it makes it others. It creates a barrier so that people can't humanize the other group because they could never see themselves in that group, because I would never be in their predicament because I'm not that. I could never be Black, right? And so I feel like that's one of the costs of racism, and then, you know, the linkage of racism to some of the other institutions that, or race to some of the other institutions that dehumanize individuals, such as crime and criminal justice, because, you know, no one likes a criminal, right? And so you can, when you link those two together, it's even more destructive, because now there's an even greater barrier to that humanization that's required.
And I think that one of the threads I hear in many of the presentations is this otherness. And it's easier to other the other if there's a visible difference. And part of the visible difference is race. But if you look at Nazi Germany, for example, what they did to the Jews is, as soon as they put them in the camps, they took away all the signs of middle class, changed the clothing, and now there were completely others. They called them a different race. And so it was easier to create this distance and not allow this empathy, that the tendency to empathize with the other that we typically have. I also wanted to speak to the other point that you mentioned, which is the cost. And with social justice, we talk a lot about the cost to the individuals who experience racism or the communities. There's the complement of that, which is the cost to society of not utilizing those talents and the waste of the talent. And I've found it in my work with business organizations that when you talk about social justice, they'll say, yeah, it's nice. But when you talk about the losses they might incur, but not by not being inclusive of diversity and not utilizing the talents, they begin to listen. One of my doctoral students just finished a study that I think is probably one of the first that shows the connection between diversity, inclusion, and innovation. And so it's not just the presence of people, diverse people, which used to be the notion, but it depends what you do with that. If you're not inclusive, then you won't benefit from that talent. And inclusion has those two elements as part of the theory behind that, is first you realize who the person really is. You see the uniqueness. At the same time, you give them a sense of belonging. I know who you are, I see who you are, and you are part of us, and we are part of you. Those two elements, not assimilation, not, you're a token, we finally have one of you, whatever that is, and we're good. But the combination of the two is what makes a difference. And you talked about what we can do with our students. That's part of what we can do, make them understand what diversity is, what otherness is, and how to become more inclusive and make those cases about the costs.
I think that in many ways, clinical social work, especially practitioners, I mean, we've been so focused on issues of anxiety and depression and substance abuse, as important as that is. But I think, you know, what you're saying is just so important, that what we know is that this capacity for us to experience the other in a way in which we see so many similarities. So for example, as social workers, we can practice in LAUSD and bring straight and gays together, and being able to talk about bullying and what that means to be shamed, and being able to resonate with each other's stories in such a way that this straight kid who once was so homophobic listens to these stories of this gay kid, and they both cry together. And there's this methodology by which we're able to sort of bring these two disparate groups together, also black and white. So I think we as clinical social workers, those of us who are involved in this particular field, really need to begin to sort of broaden our definition of the problem. It's not just anxiety. is not just depression, it is race. And you know, we're not going to see that in the California testing. You know, we need to begin to really construct a new framework by which social workers can really begin to sort of broaden how it is that we practice. And race has to be one of them. It's not, and I don't see it in the near future being one of those situations. So we have, I think, a lot to provide. The stuff is there in terms of mirror neurons, developing empathy, and things of that sort. It's there, but we need to jump and run with it.
And to build from there, I think this kind of the greatest, this is a very, very critical conversation in terms of the greatest challenges and the greatest opportunities yield ahead, in a sense of when you're thinking about kind of the set of norms and values that we expect that come from leadership, right? A new administration that is somehow given signs of reducing the importance of race or certain norms that have been discussed here. I wonder. It's the greatest challenge in terms of for institutions to emanate those norms of inclusivity, to be able to put in practice policies that promote understanding of the other, right? And that could be from anywhere from criminal justice all the way to healthcare systems. How do we think about the most vulnerable, the user at the end of the spectrum? And that's a great challenge in that sense, but at the same time a great opportunity, because it seems like at the same time there's this energy among many people like us and institutions that are really against that. And I wonder to what extent we also have to put our heads together to think of be a framework that describes some of these issues in a more pragmatic way, in terms of what is the problem, in terms of what is the social justice problem for the average citizen to understand, as well as what are these potential solutions. So a change model, right? What is the change framework? And we know, for instance, in tobacco cessation, could you believe that, like 60 years ago, the rate of smoking and how that has been reduced dramatically because of a series of disseminating messages, there's research, messages, norms, but we have an example of how a very pervasive, historically pervasive pattern of behavior has been reduced dramatically in places like the United States. I wonder to what extent we can think of similar models, similar strategies of dissemination that kind of get to implicit bias and the average person understand what is this implicit bias, how it works, and that could be embedded in policies and interactions on a day-to-day basis.
The question about tobacco is incentive. So the Surgeon General comes out and says that if you don't stop smoking, these really bad things are going to happen to you. Not to him, not to her, but to you. And so how do you create an incentive structure that incentivizes institutions, organizations, nations to behave and function a certain kind of way? Or interest convergence.
Right.
As Bell sort of talked about.
And that's what I was thinking when we were beginning to talk about how do we humanize, or even at a higher, as Miguel was talking about, at a institutional level. One, I think we really underestimate the power of race. Toni Morrison, I was talking to Larry earlier about a new piece in the New York Post, or in the New Yorker. The New Yorker. The New Yorker. I even wrote it down again for you because it was so powerful. But she talks about how what we're seeing today, this fight to save one's identity, what you're willing to do, the cowardliness, the acts that you're willing to commit when you know it is wrong. But talking about Derek Bell's work, we know from a number of instances from the civil rights movement, Brown versus Board of Education, all of these different acts that have come out. Even if we talk about the confrontation or the approach to drug laws today, it's due to interest of whites.
Sure.
It's primarily due to interest of whites. It isn't out of a social justice call. We see this issue, we need to stand up. We have to do that somewhat on a larger scale at the university or policy level as well. Whitney Young was a master at it, of understanding those two languages. We know there's a need, but I have to speak your language in order to get blacks into the workers' union, into the automotive industry. And we have to continue to do that as well. We have to use that as leverage. And how do we, us sitting together today, how do we come up with a plan to do such a thing?
It's the language, but it's also the conceptualization.
Right. Sure.
This is a stimulating conversation about race. This is our job to think and talk about race. We've studied this. This conversation, though, is not accessible right, to the people that we're talking about, to those, you know, the communities that are being discriminated against, that are affected by this problem. So it seems to me that some of the responsibility we have certainly is to educate and raise awareness, but when there are people we're studying about who have knowledge, right, that isn't reflected in the scholarship, in the coursework, in the training. To me, it seems we should be thinking about that from the beginning, making sure that we're approaching our scholarship and our teaching in a way that is relevant, that is culturally responsive, and certainly I think that could be complemented by the kind of translation. I think translation down, not necessarily a bad thing, but I agree. I think it's language, but some of it is conceptual.
I think we're just adding on to that, being supported while doing that and feeling safe.
Sure.
Because a lot of, you know, I have a chapter coming out next month or this summer in a book on looking at the white racial frame and interviewing faculty member who I call it speaking to justice, who speak to justice, and what happens to them when they stand up and say, you know, we as an institution are doing X, Y, and Z. Maybe we should be focusing this because we have this oppressive group here, or I see the low number of graduations. We need to do this for blacks, or this for Latinos. And what happens to them? The social isolation, the threats of no tenure or promotion, the inability, this sort of shackling. So once again, you have a place at the table. We have your face, but in terms of your insight into injustice, and when you speak to that in an eloquently way, not slamming your fist on the table and belligerency, but there's a danger to that. We need to have freedom and know that you're safe when we're doing this work, that conceptual work.
I'm trying to explain why some of it's.
Arlene was going to jump in.
I go back and forth myself over the extent to which we need first to change hearts and minds versus starting somewhere else, and obviously they're not mutually exclusive. But and maybe it's because I come from a health background, but I think there's a lot to be said, and there's already enough known to do things differently that without changing people's hearts and minds in the immediate future or cognitively, but over time. And I'm thinking about some work I've been involved in on, people do recognize in the issue of women in STEM, science, technology, and math, people do recognize we lose all this talent and are all trying to figure out how you get more women in STEM. And I don't know exactly what the analogy might be for race, but there, we've done work on how if in introductory college courses, STEM courses, you sort of, you give, I guess, what educators call a more growth mindset. People either think that math ability is something you're born with, and you get into this whole, again, genetic whatever, and boys are better than girls, and Asians are better. You can we could all probably make the same hierarchy of who's going to be good in math. But another approach is obviously to take what I guess they call a growth mindset, which is anybody can learn with enough persistence and work, they can learn math. And when professors give messages, all professors, all of us probably, give messages in our classrooms that suggest we believe there's a fixed or a growth mindset, even if we don't mean to or wouldn't have wanted to. When professors give growth mindsets, women do as well as men in their math classes, and when they do fixed mindset, when they give fixed mindset messages, the women do way worse. But on top of that, and this is where I am involved in it, when you give growth mindsets, there's no physiological stress response on the part of the women, and there is when you give fixed mindsets. So the idea there in the STEM field is that if professors were trained to give growth mindsets, that would probably go farther than most other interventions to start having positive recursive processes of the women doing better in math and being seen to do better in math. Because what also happens, and this is one of the problems with education, is that these stigmas and stressors and stereotype threats, they just recruit all your neural networks, and you do have a physiological stress response. When you're having a physiological stress response, cognitive thinking is not, it's backburnered. And so you also don't learn as well, and that has negative recursive processes of reinforcing stereotypes. And so I guess I'm just I don't want to make it sound too rosy, but if I think of this STEM example, you can certainly imagine a world where, professors who didn't have to have their hearts and minds changed, but just the curriculum that they were being taught was giving out growth mindset messages, and then the girls do as well in math and are enjoying it as much, and so they keep taking math and they major in math. And then people see women in math fields that over time, that would also reconstruct stereotypes. And so I guess I'm wondering whether there are ways in terms of race and practice and social work, which I don't know a lot about, unfortunately, that some of these same, the ideas about changing the media have come up, and I think that's related to this, where we get our messages everywhere in this whole kind of surround we're in. I read an interesting book called, I think it's Phantasmal Media by Fox Harrell at MIT, and he talks about how even down to the algorithms, computing practices, and whether it's in video games or in the things we do doing statistical analysis, reinforce certain stereotyped messages that are racist. And some of that's obvious, like if you look at the avatars in a variety of video games, the black ones are always this, just like with the movies. But apparently, according to Fox Harrell, this goes way deeper. So I just wonder if we focused on that kind of surround in whether it's movies, video games, the messages we give when we teach, that maybe we don't have to have changed all the hearts and minds yet, and maybe some of the hearts and minds will follow. And meanwhile, we can free people not to have their neural networks recruited by dealing with stigma and racial profiling, and which also then leads to hypertension and all the health things, which then leads to not having an electorate to vote for the people who care more about structural issues. So there's, maybe there's some steps that could be taken that way.
So to kind of piggyback off of that in terms of the cultural other, on the ground, I think one of the best things we can do is read about other cultures. I was in the first Gulf War, and I immediately read 2 books about Islam, as well as part of the Quran. My 8th grade teacher told me, and I always remembered it, wherever you go, find a good book about that city or state or town and read it. So when I moved to San Antonio, I read a book called Quixote's Prisoners, which explains why Hispanics are the predominant population there, but they're the poorest people there. And so we have to do that. I just finished a book, Strangers in Our Own Land, and Hillbilly Elegy.
Mm-hmm.
Very
Yes,
good books.
excellent. Yeah.
Strangers in Our Own Land was really problematic because the land belonged to Native Americans before.
What was ours?
But it did give me an insight to why white males feel like they are the oppressed population. While I don't agree with them, but I have a kind of level playing field to start a debate or conversation about that. That's and I listen to a lot of book tapes, so I'm not just, so that's a challenge for all of us as well as our students.
I think also from a political perspective, as somebody who's been in politics and, and have helped to mobilize social policy, I think that was one of the key is people themselves. You'll be amazed what people can actually do. Doing the mobilization of understanding where you are in society can actually change the way you behave. And take, for example, the poll tax in Britain. I'm sure many people might have heard about that around the table. Well, the poll tax was a tax that everyone had to pay, whether you were wealthy or not, on your property. So it would be the same tax if you lived in a mansion to if you lived in a small house. And people were, up in arms because it affected them personally. So there's another issue about, like the smoking theory. When it actually affects you, there is something about it. When you actually knock on people's doors as well, asking them for their vote, the first thing a lot of them will ask you is, what can you do for me? So my argument is that I think that one of the crucial and important thing is that the mobilization of people actually comes from them. And the only way that we can do that is also to educate them. And socialization is one of the key to everything. And if they're restraining 3- and 4-year-olds in nursery school, that opens a whole wealth of understanding what people's position and what people of color's positions are in society. So, the whole argument sometimes looks so broad and very difficult to actually do something about, because when we talk about it in this way around the table, all I can think of, my God, there's so much to be done. But I do think that there are ways of starting the process, and Black Lives Matter is one of those organizations that, whether you agree with everything that's been said in relation to what they want to do, I think that is a mobilization, and therefore it's like putting it out there for others to see, to say this isn't right, this is not correct, this shouldn't be happening. And that way, people are either on board or they're not on board, but at least you can see where the changes should happen and what we should be doing. And I think those are crucial perspective. Going back to the poll tax, I just finished that story around it, because I think that was one of the times that I recognized that you can do anything by mobilizing people and let them see their own interest. And what happened was that Margaret Thatcher was totally against, any changes in the poll tax. She was adamant that this wouldn't happen. In fact, her speech was, "This woman is not for turning," was partly due to the fact about the poll tax. There was no way she was turning back on it. But millions of people actually marched on Downing Street. All these people from everywhere, get in their buses, their trucks, everything, and marched on Downing Street, right? The next 2 weeks, the poll tax was gone.
Your comment about what self-interest is reminds me of Saul Alinsky's philosophy of mutual self-interest and how he was able to use that to organize in the south side of Chicago involving both blacks and whites. And I've used that phrase a lot, especially in talking about research practice partnerships or academic community partnerships, because even though in a sense they represent different cultural groups, at some point they come to realize that there are interests they have in common and interests that they, that are specific to their own particular group. But it's the ability to come together to collectively work for each other's interests that has made the difference. And to a large degree, I agree, Martel, it is a matter of learning. In fact, a couple months ago, we were at a faculty meeting talking about diversity and inclusion and how it impacts our School of Social Work. And I'd mentioned to Sherry, it'd be kind of cool to have a learning collaborative where faculty could, rather than have student organizations that are specific to specific, racial or ethnic groups, bringing people together to learn more about what their lives are like, climbing into each other's skin, a term that I heard at SWIR over the weekend last week. And that's one of the ways that social work can facilitate that kind of learning experience, I think, because it's not just a matter of working with individuals in a clinical context. That gets to the internal. It's not just a matter of advocating or organizing at the macro level, which gets to the external, but it's really the combination of the two that comes about through in fact, Lauren mentioned, quoted Cosgrave and McHugh about boundary spanning. Well, you're really spanning between social workers as a profession and the communities that we serve, for example, and what you gain from that experience. It's not just a matter of reducing depression or anxiety in clients who've been victimized by racism or poverty, but it's also what social workers gain through that experience and learn from that experience, and how maybe that's what actually produces the kind of transformation that really would target racism.
So let me also just quickly say, I absolutely believe in the power and importance of education. I would second Arlene's point about trying to sort of teach differently, imagining a growth model as something we can deploy, universally, right? Thinking about our capacity to learn more and thinking it's not blocked in. At the same time, I also want to feel like one of the things to me that I always come back to, and we've talked about it, but I guess I'll just put a finer point on it right now, is that there's something about how we've been able to use race that's about the kind of disproportionate allocation of material resources and social valuation. And so one of the things that demands is the folks who've gotten more than their fair share of it is to give it up. And so what's the argument to be made for why they should give it up? So one version is, well, if you have all of it, the folks in the streets are going to go wild. Eventually, they're going to come and get you, right? You can't wall yourself off from them, right? You can't, if you want folks to work in your business, you're going to need to teach them at least well enough so they can be entry-level service sector employee. Like there are maneuvers we make to say, well, you're going to have to give up some of that, but what's going to happen is folks are going to have to give up their disproportionate access to stuff that hasn't been distributed evenly across groups, and trying to figure out how do we do that, of what's the story you tell that really is compelling. Often the stories have to traffic in some of the same kind of assumptions about racial hierarchy, but at least you get people to the table to begin to think, well, maybe I can't hoard it all, and I can give some folks a little bit more of the pie. But I think there's a version of that relationality that's really at stake. It's not just, well, I think people need to think differently of, changing hearts and minds about like how wonderful we are, how we're all the same. It's like you have to give up stuff, right? To de-racialize, you have to give up stuff. And do you want to?
The great paradox is one of the reasons Trump was elected is precisely because many Americans thought they've given up too much.
Right.
Yeah. I've lost my everything. So there's a
right.
Wow, and so before you even say you have to give up, so you let them know that they've not given up very much,
right.
if any at all.
To that idea,
but it looks like they have.
No.
Yes.
And I come up against this in talking about reproductive disparities and looking at racism as a social determinant of that, and trying to sort of convince white folks, right, that the majority population, that this is something that is their issue too. It's not just the issue of, you know, the black community. And moving from that to thinking about the, you know, the us versus the all. And you started this off, Larry, with the whole conversation, right, of what is a more just society look like, right? How do we sort of get to that? What does more just look like? Well, in some people's eyes, more just, like progressive social policies, right, means something gets taken away or changed, right, for a population that's been privileged. And so you have to go just beyond, so how does this benefit you as well? Because that's sort of how my argument has had to shift, right, helping sort of the majority population, or talking about how this has implications for all of us, right? But also going beyond that to also realizing that underneath that is that sense of somebody that is in a privilege, or a population in a privileged position is going to have to give something up. And you have to sort of think about what is the implication for that. When you're in the privilege of privilege is you don't have to recognize your privilege. It just is, right? So once you bring that to people's awareness, it's hard to give up privilege. It's hard to give up being in, you know, in the space where everything is sort of situated around your reality, right? But I think that is something that we really have to think about in sort of making thinking about how do we go about action around these? How do we go around advocacy around this? That we have to understand this notion of privilege and the idea that inevitably, whatever it is that we're talking about in terms of progressive social policies, raising people's awareness and all that, is going to involve pain. It's going to involve populations having to give something up. And we have to understand or figure out how are we going to address that. I think your point was right on, that that's not something that I've really heard many people sort of talking about. It's more than just what are the implications for all of us. It's understanding that a large segment of the population that is privileged and has enjoyed privilege for quite a long time is going to be asked to give something up, or that's going to be part of the solution that we all think about in terms of changing social structures. Social structure systems are set up to perpetuate what's already in place, right?
And that's why really race doesn't only harm us, people of color, but it also harms disadvantaged groups too in society. So the point I was making, which links on to yours and John Diane, is the fact that if we were to mobilize ourselves, all of us who are disadvantaged, instead of using race, the social constructed ideas, to actually group together, but that's not what it's done. Race has divided us, and piecemeal things are given to us, and the privilege remain in certain people's hands. I mean, it serves a purpose, but how do we actually reverse that? If I'm privileged, right, I can assure you it's very hard to want to give anything to anybody, because there's a sense of, you know, it's rightfully mine. And I think that reading the book that you read, Martel, about the
Hillbilly Elegy.
Yeah. That's really, I don't agree with everything that's happening there, but it sort of opened my eyes to see that there were another disadvantaged group of people suffering, right? They weren't people of color, but they were still suffering. And so how do we then, extend the way that we're actually feeling to embrace that group, or get that group to also embrace us, to work together?
I might be the only historian in the room, so pull that privileged historian's card. I mean, this has been a conversation about white Americans and their sense of loss, going back post-Civil War, right? Hofstede's status anxiety, right? The paranoid politics that Hofstede writes about. And so this is not an original argument. And so at this point, I'm actually more focused on 2043, and the fact that we're going to look more like Hawaii, and like saying Hawaii, not California, than Ohio. By 2043, a majority minority American, and what the implications for that and the people in this room moving forward and the ways we can mobilize with brown and yellow and progressive white folk. A 21st century, maybe rainbow coalition. Because, as I say, I'm a bit more pessimistic about the ways in which we can move the average white person, in all honesty. And so it's more about the majority minority America we're headed toward.
But I would say this, though. I totally agree. But I would also say this, which is the most disgusting, fascinating thing and beautiful about racism, is that it has its way of converting. It has its way of fitting the times. We're seeing it now with Latinos in terms of the census, or some of the census numbers that have come out. Previously identifying as Latino, now as white. So we're beginning to find people still associating, even we see this in other countries, Brazil, Nicaragua, South Korea. People are still associating with whiteness, finding this need to associate, because if you have that, that still has value. So even though we may still have this mixing of colors, people are still seeking that valuable coin to hang on to.
Actually, the pattern, well, that I've observed is actually it's more complex than that.
Yeah.
I think it's actually Latinos have actually gone to the other. And there have been more other that the census actually is problematizing that and saying, wow, now we have to really figure out this box other, because now it's getting to the 5, 7, 8%.
Right.
And that is really America in 2060. It is this kind of more complex notion of what race and ethnicity and identity is. And I think that calls for, right now, for kind of a leadership process that really kind of a voice that is not one person, of course, but that has been kind of growing here in a sense of what's a need for institutions and some certain leaders to speak up and really talk about this issue in a very concrete, cogent way to say we all are at loss in the way we're dividing, and that there's a really high cost for dividing. Of course. It's really high cost, and to really clearly tell the upper and middle white class what the cost to them, as well as the lower middle, kind of immigrant, what the cost for all of us to somehow not address something that should be more cohesive and some more kind of connecting.
And it's precisely because we're still sort of multiracial, sort of fluidity sort of moment, right? That we really, it's the moments of essence that we build these racial bridges right now. Right. And going back to history, think of Steve N. Woodward's opportunities lost, right, in the aftermath of the Civil War, after Reconstruction, right? When there are opportunities to build brown and tan bridges, fusion politics, in which the elites come in and drive a wedge between these fusion politics across the country. It's precisely this historical moment that we need to seize this opportunity now across racial lines and with progressive white folk.
That's why I think, let me say this point, that's why I think the framework that we've learned from history in this country and through even Hollywood is this notion of crisis will unite us, right? It is only through crisis that it was 9/11, and that's where all this rhetoric came out of. It doesn't matter who you are. We run together, we go get people, so it's the only framework we have, or that I know so far, that actually brings people together and says we all have equal responsibility. We have shared responsibility.
That crisis framework that jumps right out is when we had the same crisis that we had in 9/11, after Hurricane Katrina, you had Sean Penn rowing up there 4 days in, handing out fresh water because FEMA still couldn't get its act together. Crises don't always bring us together. It depends on who the victims are of those crises. If there's a panic of empathy for those victims, or if there is indifference, deep indifference.
And that crisis turned Muslims into a scapegoated group far more than they had. I don't want to compete with you for pessimism, but but I guess I wonder, and thinking historically, not as far back as you have or with the credentials to do so, but it seems like, you know, everyone talks about we're going to have this majority-minority society, but I don't believe we will, because it seems like, you know, before, around World War II, many people who are now considered white were not considered white, and part of what, it's not just that people start self-identifying as white or other, but it's also that policy, you know, it decides who gets to be white, and suddenly these privileges we're talking about, or these things you have to give up that some groups didn't used to have, now they have them. And so it's a very, I guess I'm wondering how we avoid that happening.
I want to piggyback off of that thought, because what I would be concerned with happening is that the only way to assimilate is by mixing, and so you create another class, and so you end up with, because that's happened historically as well, so then you end up with the darker individuals, those who haven't been able to do that are on the bottom still, so, you know, and you sort of, you develop that social hierarchy based on skin shade, right? And so I think we have to be careful of that, and it's really how do we get people to see Black as human? Not that any of those things are wrong or any of that, but it's just Black should not be equated with bad, right? And so how do we change that?
And I think that's what my point I was making before is that it not only, you know, the way we see Black, or I always like to say people who are given the pass to be into the club of whiteness. You know, we've seen that throughout history until you're finally a permanent member. You know, you try out, you pay your dues. Sure. You follow our ideology and our mission, our code, you know, and then finally you're given the permanent pass. You are white. We've seen it with Italians and Irish, so we've seen this in history. We've seen it with all other groups, immigrant groups who have come over, except for the idea of wanting to associate with Blackness. So that's why I was bringing back the association, what we're seeing in Brazil, what we're seeing in South Korea. Regardless, you know, people are still searching to make sure you mix with white, or the whitest as you can, or the lightest, because it buys power. So we may have these groups who are mixed up, who look more like Hawaii. But I don't want people to, maybe it's the pessimistic side of me, I don't want people to underestimate that striving for that power, what whiteness brings, the lightness. If I can't be completely, I'll be as close as possible. It brings currency. It does. And I think one of our first initiatives is, in terms of education, is one, being realistic. Let's look in the mirror when we're talking to our students, we're talking administration, we're talking about changing policies. We have to be realistic, and we have to be honest. These are the stakes. This is what history has shown us. If we are not to repeat it, we must educate ourselves on what our current status is and what's the significance of that as we move forward. Too many times people scratch at the surface when we talk about this, you know, as opposed to being realistic. What are we facing in the 21st century, and how do we move forward, honestly?
So, Jody, I thought when you talked about crisis, you were going to also give us another piece, which is the ruling class also ushers in things like the surveillance society, which happened with Katrina, as well as 9/11. And then we saw in Ferguson, in the crisis there playing out, was the use of armored personnel characters on the civilian population. We also saw George Bush after 9/11 say that the military could be used in civilian capacities, which we had laws against that. So other things have been ushered in along with the crisis. So it's one thing about socialization and educating people to understand the cultural other. The other problem of that is going to take organized protests to get us out of this. That's the point I think you're making. What America needs to understand is that freedom is never free. Each generation must earn it. That is why it is so precious. You know, Mahatma Gandhi, seen as a peaceful person, really when he went to the British people, he said, and they said, we're going to stop, you're going to leave. And they said, how? You're dressed in like a sheep. He said, yes, but I have 700,000 Zeeks back there with knives, and they want freedom. And so if we think about the founding of this country, good, bad, indifferent, homophobic, gender biased, and racist, the founders of the country got tired of the tyranny from Britain and took them on. And so we're going to have to do something about the conditions and context that we find ourselves in. As Malcolm X said, if you want to know what I do for my freedom, that's what you would do for yours, and then double it. He also said, if you can't tell the truth, you don't deserve to be free. That's right. And so that's what we see the young people doing. That's what Black Lives Matter is about, is that there is some trepidation and trampling on their freedom, and they're organizing. It is race that disallows us from saying that that is a start of a larger problem, and they have nothing there. It's out of necessity that they're doing this. And I think that was part of the point you
had. And BLM recognizes that numbers don't mean anything without unity. Zip, zero again. You know, you can have all the numbers in the world, but if you're engaged in all this lateral denigration, which goes on in the black community and what BLM is getting at, you got to be a squeaky clean, immaculate, good Negro to get any sympathy, care, and concern if you're shot or beat by the police. You can't be selling a Lucy on the sidewalk. You have to be Dudley goddamn do-right, right, to get any kind of love from the state in terms of any equality of treatment. And their whole point is, we're coming in, numbers aren't enough. You have that kind of lateral denigration going on with people like Chris Rock, launching his comedic career saying, I love black people, but I hate niggas, and defining a nigga as a black person who does a crime. That's his core definition. You know, black professors like Randall Kennedy at Harvard say the same thing, only he says in the more genteel language of the academy, we need to distinguish between good and bad Negroes. Bad Negroes being the lawbreakers. Over half the Congressional Black Caucus voted for the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act that created the 100-to-1 powder-to-crack disparity, for the first time put in mandatory minimums in federal law. Right? That isn't just whites oppressing blacks, whites driving mass incarceration. That is black folk and white folk and a lot of other folk piling on black criminals and saying that a moral distinction is different than a, let's say, economic distinction. It just so happens that most of those bad Negroes are from truly disadvantaged ranks. The middle class black crime rate and the middle class white crime rate are about the same. So when Chris Rock says, I hate those N-words, he's really saying, I love middle class blacks, I hate truly disadvantaged blacks disproportionately. That's what he's saying. It's a moral distinction. It's really rather a class distinction masquerading as a moral distinction, but we buy that moral discourse and distinction, and we inflict it on ourselves. So I don't care what your numbers are. If you're look how 53% of white women voted for an avowedly virulent misogynist. But that's, I mean, the numbers didn't change that. The numbers alone aren't going to get you there.
But what are the percentages of racial minorities who voted for Obama? Getting back to your point, you're absolutely right in terms of the CBC, but the CBC was also more pliable and more responsive to their constituents a generation or two later.
After the damage had been done, 30 years of mass incarceration,
but far more pliable, though.
I was there with them. I was going to those hearings, and I remember them standing there, people like Charlie Rangel with a big grin on his face as Reagan was signing in the bill, in the law. And I still hear him around here. Jackie Lacey, she's the black DA of LA County now, right? She's sending guys to the jail for 25 to life as an 18-year-old taking a cell phone from the backseat of an unoccupied car. That's in 2017.
No, I mean, we don't have to go back. No, Rockefeller talks about basically the ways in which he relied upon the black community, right? This is Michael Foote that talks about in his book, Black Silent Majority, right? So he talks about the ways in which he relied upon the black community to push the drug laws. Absolutely right. Sure. I just think that actually that black political officials are more responsive probably to the black community, since that's their base of support.
And if that black community they're responsive to is a politics of respectability black community that says, I love black people, but I hate N-words, then they're going to respond to that, which they have, and they're going to themselves perpetrate the new Jim Crow. We put Jim Crow on the new Jim Crow on ourselves. And to deny that, not to recognize that, is going to slip us back into the same problems a little later. We forget it, and here we go again.
I agree that there's this internalization of racism, and part of it might have to also do with some self-interest, where it's in my self-interest to punish these individuals and to make sure that they're put away because they're hurting my prospect of advancing, and they're hurting how I'm looked upon in society, right? So I'm going to punish them even harder then what I might punish them. And but it could also be that that's sort of another type of internalization of racism as well. But to your point as well, it could be maybe they didn't quite understand. They were using the resources that were made available at the time and didn't quite understand, because the education resources, maybe it's we as a society choose to fund criminal justice over those other resources.
The problem is, you look at the record, they knew, we were telling them, there were debates, they just went down that road. Clinton came in and said, we got to outflank the Republicans. We've been getting beat. Willie Horton cost us the Dukakis election. We're going to, $12 billion in new prisons, we're going to put in, we're going to slash welfare, we're going to get rid of the FDR program, and we're going to just outflank the Republicans on crime and on these kinds of issues, right? Yeah. Show you we're tougher on them than you are, and so at the end of the day, I'm not sure that it was lack of awareness. It was just that our arguments didn't prevail, and we're at a moment when our arguments can't prevail in a time like I haven't seen in 30 years of doing this. There hasn't been a moment like this, thanks to Black Lives Matter. Michelle Alexander, her 2010 book, helped to start to get a lot of white liberals thinking differently, certainly about mass incarceration, seeing it as a social justice issue and not just bad people doing bad things. But then BLM came in, and that's why we're talking so much today.
And real quick, we're so misguided that black folks said that Bill Clinton was the first black president after all that was going on.
I was just going to for a moment about BLM, because to me this is sort of an exciting moment, and to think about like what we can take from that and how we can be part of that. So it's BLM led by youth and started by queer youth, right? Queer youth of color, and kind of I'm curious how their own identities is liminal kind of allows for this movement to grow in what some are arguing quite different from the civil rights movement in terms of leadership and how it's working. And I'm just curious, in terms of sort of the youth and the youth leading, and what around this table, how do we become a part of that? How does that become different? Because I don't think it is really about numbers, right? I'm thinking about absolutely. South Africa and Black South Africa, far outnumbered white South Africa.
I think though that one of the important, it's good that you raised the issue about South Africa, because I think that that's one of the most important historical perspective for our lives, in a way. How there were so many black people in South Africa, yet they were in the minority, and how poorly they were treated. I think that part of all of this, though, is that surely we're sick of being second-class citizens, because that's what we are. And unless we are at the table to become first-class citizens, then we're always going to be in the same positions that we currently find ourselves. So the argument is, for me, is, okay, John made the point too, that you and Tiana, that you have to actually give up something, that people have to give up something. Right. I struggle a bit with that, because I know when people have something, it's very hard to, and they think that something is precious. And I think if you look at the political context that we currently live in at the moment, and we see the new person coming into the White House, all the argument goes back to people not wanting to give up anything. You listen to all the rhetoric and what's being said. It's all about the fact that they don't wish to give up anything. So the reason that I'm talking about massive organization of ourselves, but with other disadvantaged group of people, so that we're not in the position of just weighing up disadvantages. Because I think that when you do that, we're in a sticky situation. You're worse than me, you might not be so worse, don't talk about resources should come to me, shouldn't go to you. We should be, I know it might be a utopia suggestion, I don't know, but I have this strong feeling that unless we unite with the disadvantaged groups that are around, because they're also second-class citizens, whether they recognize it or not, they are. And how can we then mobilize ourselves in a more unified way?
Well, here's what I've seen with BLM, interestingly. We're marching through the streets, 8,000 people in Inglewood about 6-7 months ago. Nobody, they came out of nowhere. We were thinking maybe 120 people for some pizza, you know, and suddenly 8,000. And as we were marching along, I'd say 40–50% of the crowd was non-black. Latino, white, and Asian allies of Black Lives Matter. Then we went downtown. The allies of Black Lives Matter, not the main organizers themselves or any black folk, created a human chain around Central Division headquarters downtown, right? As these allies are walking along with Black Lives Matter in both those settings, they're very clear on the message. It isn't people of color's lives matter. It isn't all marginalized lives matter. It's Black Lives Matter, right? And that focus, recognizing some of these other things. But if you want to talk about what has made this movement so successful, they've had a very clear, precise focus. And their allies have gotten on board. Their thing is, when Black Lives Matter, all lives are going to matter. You know, the face is at the bottom of the well. You go down here to Skid Row, 75%, as this ethnographer just pointed out, Stephen Forrest Stewart, and down out and under arrest. He embedded himself for 5 years down here in Skid Row and wrote this ethnography, awesome, rode with the LAPD too. 75% of Skid Row is black. You come, when I take my students up to San Quentin, we sit down, black, it looks like Skid Row, right? When Black Lives Matter, they're all gonna matter, right? And that's what they, you know, kind of, the allies got and get. And it prevents some of that race to the bottom kind of mentality that people fall into and try to, you know, jockey one another for, you know, the most oppressed. You know, sadly, that title's already taken. Right. You know, it's about 400 years behind. I wish it were otherwise. Trust me, I'd gladly give that title to someone else if they wanted it. We could come up. I'd rather have nobody, you know, oppressed, of course, but black folks have been, you know, title holding for 400 years. I'd gladly give that to someone else, but.
And that comes back to Robin's point. When we talk about giving up privilege, we have to think about who we're giving it to. Right, so in this educational climate where we're emphasizing diversity as we should and inclusion as we should, we can't forget that oftentimes race trumps other aspects of identity and self, not always. And so we're talking about giving up privilege to allies in different groups. My concern is that somehow we're going to lose sight of the focus on race.
That's always happened. Yeah.
But then, you know, let me just raise the issue of, I mean, for the purpose of what we want, it's kind of go back to some kind of a standard of equity, you know, kind of justice and equity. I wonder what would be strategies to actually get there that may not, and I'm just thinking out loud, may not really categorize groups. Because there's something that we lose when we categorize groups, right? And that we have lost in terms of really building momentum, really bringing bridging. And I don't know if the specific dynamics that happen and that might be replicated in terms of people really connecting with a cause. And that they forget about their own identity and they connect with the cause and they align up. But I wonder to what extent this new kind of leadership and this new movement is going to really connect with something more personal, more individual and personal, and that bring them all together in such a way that there's actually a coalition. So I just wonder sometimes the rhetoric is about groups, and then in essence sometimes establish a structure of differences.
That might be the
unintentionally.
Humanizing black people. Robin's point out.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, sorry. No, I think there's sort of two things maybe that have to happen, is that the humanization, but then also the recognition of the social cost. I think if you recognize the social cost of racism, things will happen much more quickly. So it might be like Black Lives Matter is the humanization. And Jody brought up, you know, if you look at the folks who are on Skid Row and who are in prison, you know, you'll see a big chunk of them, disproportionately, they're African American. So if you take care of the least off in society, it makes everyone better off. one example maybe of that in your wheelhouse might be, you know, losing civil liberties because of racism. For example, all of the civil liberties that we lost after 9/11 because of the terrorist attacks, and we had this other group that we could sort of pinpoint in society to say, oh, well, if they pass these laws, it's okay, they're not going to impact me because I know they're looking for a certain type of person. But once you lose them, everyone loses them, right? And so that could eventually come back around and bite all of us in the butt eventually, right, in the future. But we sort of, that racism makes us believe that only certain groups are going to be impacted by that particular legislation. And I don't think it's any different than crime bills or any, you know, and you could weigh in on that as well. But I think that's one idea of something that I think all of us care greatly about.
I think this is why work with like Tom Shapiro and his institute is so important at Brandeis. It's a racial policy audit. So they run every sort of social policy, says what's the racial implications for black and brown and yellow people for this particular social policy. So a racial audit, basically, of social policy, I think will get at that question that you're trying to get at.
But whether folks in general will think that an attack on civil liberties for this group will redound to my detriment and wind up hurting me, boomeranging on me in some way, and infringe my liberty. Unfortunately, that just isn't how it works, right? In stop and frisk in New York, which they had up until 3 years ago, the white folk on Fifth Avenue weren't getting stopped and frisked like the people in the Bronx and other parts of New York were getting stopped and frisked, right?
Yeah, I understand that, but I was thinking more in terms of the legislation that was passed to combat terrorism and how they all can tap in, you know, into our phones now, right?
They'll mainly impose that on Muslims and people. I've had a colleague tell me, a law professor, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, why do you have a problem with people walking in your home? You know, why do you have, you know, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who really feel that way. It's like, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the big deal? Right.
But until you show that, oh, well, they're actually doing it to us as well. So they started tapping into a lot of people's phones after that, right? Not just, it wasn't just folks who were,
people who aren't bothered by that. There are a lot of people who aren't particularly bothered by that.
Because if you're not doing anything wrong.
Yeah, they're just kind of, you know, that is the brunt of that is being born, you know, who's bearing the brunt of that? Some people who aren't me. That's true. And as long as they aren't me.
That is true, yeah.
I'll say too, maybe like another area of cost to think about is emotional cost, because in thinking about Black Lives Matter and how they go into the spaces of the symphony, right? Like a white space where there's very particular ideas about how you interact in that space. And so there's also a bringing of, like, well, here we're matter, and we're going to be in your face in the spaces where you don't expect to see us. Right. And so there's a loss there to, like, you know, if our spaces are being invaded and there's kind of like an emotional, you know?
On the side,
That maybe, I mean, I think that in part has been effective. So maybe if we can't think about, like, cost in terms of, you know, material cost, maybe there's something to kind of an emotional, like, oh, we're going to have to face these, it's so uncomfortable, I don't want to hear them right now in the symphony, right? Or at the sporting events, or I mean, I think that's been a brilliant strategy.
There may actually be even a financial cost. So, for example, I can't recall, what was the university they got the president to resign? The football team. Missouri. Okay, so Mizzou. That was the power of finance.
That's right.
Because they knew what was happening on Saturday was the game on ABC, which brought in how many millions of dollars. They reacted to them, and all of a sudden they had some sort of empathy to an extent.
And what was the reaction after that?
Yeah,
they passed the law.
Right.
If you do it again, we'll take your scholarship.
Right.
So it's going to happen.
Right. So there shows some power in that, but it has to be a follow-up. It has to be not just a one-shot deal to show people that, you know, financially, if you're not going to see us on a human side, we will financially rebel. So there's multiple ways of doing it. It's just, you know, consolidating an action.
So that was the first act? during the panel. And I thought it was incredible, the discussion. And we have 3 more very provocative interventions later on that I think we're also going to be able to sink our teeth into and think really substantively about. So at this point, Cherry, we're going to take a break.
Yeah, so we're going to take a break. So they're just going to clean away. So we're going to set up lunch, and then the provost and the dean will be here. And the provost is Provost Michael Quick, who is, well, I don't know if people heard Dean Flynn's message last night, but she spoke very highly of him, and he's one of these provosts that understands some of these issues, and he has definitely opened the door here at USC to start the process of people talking together, having these conversations, but also to try and readdress some of the imbalances that actually exist here. And that is tremendous. It's not an easy thing when you're in academia, as you know. And Terence pointed out something that I thought that was quite interesting, and that was the fact that, you know, sometimes when people speak up, there are consequences involved in speaking up. So it's not an easy thing that one can do. So to get a provost that is, you know, having such an impact is something that is very meaningful to us. Of course, he couldn't do this without the president as well, who is on board with this. So I'd like to mention that the president, too, is very in favor of us moving forward on issues of race relations and addressing some of the imbalances that happen here. Thank you. And of course, thank John and everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
It was a very, very enlightening discussion. I mean, this is what it's about, really, that we feel free enough to voice these opinions, and out of them, we'll have ideas on how to go forward and help our communities. I mean, that's the goal. The goal is not to keep it among ourselves in this room, because sometimes you're just preaching to the converted. What we want to do is take it outside, and this is the idea. So thank you.